It was early September, the kind of early fall morning where the air is crisp but still carries a hint of summer's warmth. I was 28, and after years of letting my job, relationships, and city life control me, I decided to take a break. I wanted to reconnect with nature, clear my head, and see if being alone in the wilderness could help me get a sense of direction again. The plan was simple: a solo hike through the southern Cascades, starting from a trailhead that I had found online. It wasn't a particularly famous hike, but it looked like the perfect balance of challenging and remote. I told a few people what I was doing, but no one seemed too concerned. People never do when you're doing something you've done 100 times before. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and a few days' worth of food. I also brought a compass, a map, and a flashlight just in case. I didn't think I'd need them, though. I had done enough hiking over the years to know how to take care of myself out here, or so I thought. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, the kind of fresh scent that makes you feel like you've left the world behind. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the only sign of life was a couple who had just finished their hike and were heading back to their car. We exchanged polite nods, but that was it. I didn't come here to socialize, and I didn't expect anyone else to be out there either. The trail began easy enough. At first, it was a dirt path winding through dense forest. Tall trees formed a canopy overhead, and the sunlight filtering through the leaves created a beautiful dappled pattern on the ground. The sound of my boots crunching the gravel and dirt was the only thing that broke the silence. There were no birds singing, no animals scurrying, just a strange quiet that made me feel like I was in a world of my own. I checked the map a few times. The route seemed straightforward, a few miles of steady incline followed by a flat plateau where I planned to set up camp for the night. It wasn't a difficult hike, but I didn't mind. I wasn't in a hurry. The idea was to unwind, not break any records. Hours passed as I hiked deeper into the woods, and the day slowly drifted into late afternoon. The trail began to narrow, and the trees grew thicker, more tangled. There was something about the way the shadows stretched longer and longer that gave me an uneasy feeling. I shook it off. It was just the natural course of things. Hiking is full of strange feelings. Then, something unusual caught my attention. A few hundred yards ahead of me, the trail veered off into what looked like a small clearing. At first, I thought it might be a natural path around a large boulder or a fallen tree. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. There was an old wooden sign, barely visible through the overgrowth. The words had faded to the point where I couldn't make them out, but the shape of it was unmistakable. It looked like an old trail marker. I had done my research before the trip, and this didn't appear on any of the maps I had seen. My curiosity got the best of me, and against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. The trail led down a steep incline into a small ravine, the trees growing even denser here. The underbrush was thick, and I had to push through branches and vines as I made my way further into the hollow. After a few more steps, I found myself standing on the edge of a small stream. The water was clear and fast-moving, cutting through rocks and pebbles as it flowed downward. The area felt isolated, almost forgotten. It was peaceful, but there was something strange about the stillness, something that felt a little off, like the world had paused and was waiting for me to move on. I stood there for a while, watching the water. It was a peaceful sight, but the longer I looked, the more unsettled I became. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the silence of the place, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the fading daylight. I forced myself to shrug off the feeling and turn back up the path. But as I retraced my steps, I noticed something strange. The trail that I had come down was no longer visible. It was as if the woods had closed in behind me, erasing any sign of where I had been. I stopped, a twinge of panic bubbling up in my chest. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself that I had simply lost my way in the thick woods. It had happened before, and I was capable of finding my bearings. I pulled out my map, but the map didn't make sense anymore. The contours of the land, the markers on the map, it all seemed wrong, distorted. I flipped through the pages, feeling an unsettling tightness in my chest. I was sure I had been on the right trail, but now nothing matched. The sun was setting quickly, and the dense trees around me grew darker by the minute. It was clear I wouldn't make it to my planned campsite now. I needed to find a place to set up for the night, but the trail seemed to have disappeared altogether. I pushed forward, trying to stay calm, trying to follow the sound of the stream, which I hoped would lead me back to familiar ground. But no matter how far I walked, nothing looked right. The trees were taller here, the ground uneven, and the silence was thick, almost suffocating. I began to wonder if I was lost, really lost. Panic was beginning to set in, but I fought it down. I'd been in tough situations before, and I knew I couldn't let fear control me. I took a deep breath and scanned the surroundings. There was a ridge ahead of me, and I decided to climb it, hoping to get a better view of the land. Maybe from the top, I could figure out where I was. The climb was harder than I expected. The slope was steep, and the rocks were loose, making it hard to find secure footing. By the time I reached the top, I was breathing heavily, my legs sore from the climb. I looked around, hoping to spot something familiar, but there was nothing. Just more trees, more forest stretching endlessly in every direction. I stood there for a moment, staring at the endless green. I wasn't sure what to do next. I had no cell service, and the compass wasn't much help in the dense woods. It felt like I was trapped in a never-ending maze, and the more I moved, the more I seemed to lose my way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker still. I had no choice but to set up camp. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option. I found a small patch of flat ground near a cluster of trees and set up my tent as quickly as I could. I knew I wouldn't sleep much, but I had to rest if I was going to figure things out in the morning. The night passed slowly. Every little noise in the woods seemed amplified, every creak of the trees, every rustle in the leaves. The darkness felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I kept thinking I saw movement in the corners of my eyes, but every time I looked, there was nothing. I told myself I was just tired, that it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent. I had hardly slept, and I felt groggy and disoriented. I packed up my things and decided to move forward, hoping to find my way back to the main trail. The forest seemed different now, less welcoming and more foreboding. As I walked, I kept checking my map, trying to get a sense of where I was. But the more I looked, the more lost I felt. The landmarks didn't match, and the terrain didn't match either. It was like I was walking in a different part of the world. Hours passed, and I had no choice but to keep going. Couldn't give up, not yet. Then, just as I was about to lose all hope, I stumbled upon a familiar marker, a signpost, weathered by time but still legible. It pointed to the main trail, and for the first time in days, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I followed the signpost, and soon enough, the trail opened up again, the trees becoming less dense. The path was easier to navigate now, and as I emerged from the woods, I found myself back at the trailhead. Couldn't believe it. I was out. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, but I made it. I knew then that the experience had changed something in me. It wasn't just about the hike or the woods anymore. It was about learning to trust myself, even when things seemed hopeless. I never thought a simple hike could go so wrong. It started as a normal Saturday morning. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, and the trail ahead of me wound through dense Oregon woods, just like it had 100 times before. I'd been hiking these parts since I was a kid, knew every bend, every fallen log, every patch of poison oak to avoid. But that day, something was off. Maybe it was the way the wind didn't rustle the leaves like usual. Maybe it was the silence, too heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I adjusted my backpack, feeling the weight of my water bottle and the protein bars I'd packed. My phone was in my pocket, but out here, service was spotty at best. Not that I needed it. I knew this trail, or at least I thought I did. The first sign that something was wrong came about an hour in. A fallen tree blocked the path, a massive Douglas fir, its roots torn from the earth like some giant had yanked it free. That wasn't there last week. I frowned, stepping around it, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The ground here was softer than it should be, like it had rained recently, but the weather had been dry for days. I kept walking. The trail twisted, leading me deeper into the trees. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, golden streaks, but the farther I went, the darker it got. The air smelled different too. Less pine, more damp earth, and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. I shook my head. Probably just a dead animal nearby. Then I saw the second sign. A piece of fabric, torn and dirty, snagged on a low branch, dark green like from a jacket. I reached out, touched it. The fibers were stiff, crusted with something dark. Dried mud, maybe. Or I pulled my hand back. This wasn't right. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing, just some hiker who'd ripped their clothes on the trail. Happened all the time, so I kept going. The trees grew thicker, their trunks pressing close like they were trying to block my path. The trail, what was left of it, was narrow now, barely more than a deer track. My boots crunched over twigs and dead leaves, the sound too loud in the quiet. Then I heard it, a snap. Not from me. I froze. My breath came too fast, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sound had come from my left, deep in the underbrush. Something big, too big to be a squirrel or a bird. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but I felt it, the weight of eyes on me, watching. I forced myself to breathe. Probably just a deer. They got spooked easy. I took a step forward. Another snap, closer this time. My fingers tightened around the strap of my backpack. I didn't have a weapon, just a pocket knife, useless against anything bigger than a rabbit. Then I saw it. Movement, a shadow between the trees, low to the ground. Not a deer. Too wide, too wrong. My stomach dropped. Bear? No, bears didn't move like that. This thing was slow, deliberate, like it was stalking. I took a step back. My boot hit a root, and I barely caught myself from stumbling. The shadow paused. Then it shifted, turning toward me. Run. The thought hit me like lightning. I didn't wait. I spun and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my arms and face. I didn't care. I just ran. Behind me, something gave chase. I could hear it. The heavy thud of footsteps, the rustle of leaves. Too fast, too close. My lungs burned. My legs screamed, but I didn't stop. The trail was gone now. I was in the thick of it, trees everywhere, no landmarks, no way out. Panic clawed at my throat. I was lost, really, truly lost. Then a break in the trees. Clearing. I sprinted toward it, hope surging. Maybe I could lose whatever was behind me in the open. I burst into the clearing and skidded to a stop. No, the ground dropped away in front of me. A steep ravine cutting through the earth like a wound. Too wide to jump, too deep to climb down. I was trapped. I turned. It stood at the edge of the trees. Not an animal. A man. Tall, gaunt, his clothes ragged and stained. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken and dark. In one hand, he held a knife. Rusted. Bloody. He smiled. I backed up, my heels at the edge of the ravine. No way out. No way but down. The man took a step forward. I didn't think. I jumped. The fall was longer than I expected. Branches snapped against me, tearing at my skin. The ground rose up fast, too fast. Impact. Pain exploded through my side. My vision blurred, but I was alive. I forced myself up, biting back a scream. My ribs screamed in protest, my ankle throbbing. But I couldn't stop. I limped forward, following the ravine's slope, praying it led somewhere. Anywhere. Behind me, I heard scrambling. He was coming. I moved faster, my breath ragged. The ravine narrowed, the walls rising higher. Then a break, a shallow stream cutting through the rocks. I followed it, stumbling over wet stones. The water was icy, soaking through my boots, but it was leading somewhere. Then I saw it. A road, just a dirt path, but it was something. Civilization. I dragged myself onto the bank, crawling at first, then forcing myself to stand. My legs shook, but I kept moving. An engine rumbled in the distance. I turned. A pickup truck, old and battered, rolled into view. I waved my arms, my voice raw from screaming. The truck slowed, stopped. An older man stepped out, his face lined with concern. "Jesus, kid, you okay?" I opened my mouth. No words came. "Just soube." He didn't ask questions, just helped me into the truck, his grip firm. "Hospital," he muttered. "Now." As we drove away, I looked back at the woods. The trees stood silent, watching, but the man was gone. For now, I closed my eyes and didn't look back again. It was early fall in the Adirondacks, the air crisp and cool. I was 29 years old, just an average guy with a craving for solitude and a love for nature. I had taken time off work for a hiking trip, no real destination in mind, just an escape. The weather forecast had been clear, and I figured it would be the perfect time for a solo hike. I didn't often venture out on my own, but something about the peacefulness of the woods was calling to me. I parked my old Subaru at a small trailhead early in the morning, the fog thick over the lake in the distance, the kind of fog that blankets everything, makes the world feel like it's in a dream, where things aren't quite as they should be. I shoved my backpack onto my shoulders, making sure to check that everything I needed was there. Water, food, a first aid kit, extra layers, and a flashlight. It wasn't a particularly strenuous trail by most standards, but I still prepared as if it could turn into something more. The trail was barely a path at first, just dirt and rocks worn down by countless steps over the years. The trees towered above me, their branches intertwined, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the ground. The first hour or so was peaceful. I hiked along without a care, the air cool against my skin. I'd stop now and then to take in the view or sip water. Everything felt normal, even calm. But then, about 2 hours in, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped. The air grew heavier. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Maybe it was the lack of noise, how suddenly it seemed like everything had gone still. No birds singing, no rustling leaves, just that deep silence that comes with the feeling of being watched. It's a feeling I know well now, but at the time I shrugged it off. It was probably just the quiet of the forest. After all, I was deep into the wilderness now, far from the usual trailheads and populated areas. The path began to narrow, the trees thickening around me. The further I went, the more overgrown the trail became. I had to duck and weave through low branches and step carefully around large roots that reached up like twisted fingers. It was definitely not a well-traveled area, but I had been expecting that. By late afternoon, I had reached a clearing that overlooked a valley below. It wasn't much of a view, just a spread of trees and a distant, winding river. I took a break, sitting on a large rock, my pack at my feet. My stomach growled, so I pulled out a granola bar, chewing slowly, trying to soak in the peace. But the feeling of being watched had grown stronger, and I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I took a deep breath, told myself it was just the isolation, and got back to my feet. I had planned to make camp here for the night, maybe set up by the river. I had a small tent, and I figured the clearing would be a good spot to settle for the night. But something stopped me, a sound, a faint crack of a twig breaking, far off in the trees behind me. I froze, listening. My pulse quickened, and I turned to face the direction where I thought I'd heard the noise. Nothing, just trees. A light breeze moved through the leaves, but that was it. I could see for a good distance, and there wasn't a person in sight. But that feeling, it grew, a sense that I wasn't alone. I could hear my breath a little too loud in the quiet air, and my skin prickled. I shrugged it off again, trying to stay calm, and decided to press forward. I figured if I just kept moving, I would shake the weird feeling. The next stretch of trail was steep. I had to climb over rocks and uneven ground, the trail snaking up the ridge. The further I climbed, the more isolated it felt. It was like the world had shrunk down to just me and the forest. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I kept moving, but my legs were growing tired. As the sun sank lower, I decided to push on a little further before setting up camp. I had a headlamp in my bag, but I didn't want to use it unless I really had to. There was no reason to panic. Then, as I neared the top of the ridge, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed to split. There was a narrow, winding path leading off to the right, almost hidden behind thick trees and brush. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it certainly wasn't marked. I stood at the junction for a moment, considering my options. I could turn around, head back down the main trail and find somewhere to camp. Or I could take the unexplored path, see where it led. Curiosity won out. I stepped off the main trail, my boots crunching through the underbrush as I moved into the unknown. The further I went, the quieter it got. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. My mind kept telling me to turn back, but my body kept moving forward, drawn by the strange allure of the unknown path. The air grew colder as I went deeper. The trees around me became denser, their branches twisting into strange shapes. I had no idea how far I had gone or how long I had been walking. The sun had fully disappeared, and now I relied entirely on the dim light from my headlamp. And then I saw it, a structure. It wasn't a cabin or a house. It was small, almost like a shack, barely visible through the trees. It looked abandoned, rotting wood, a sagging roof. It was hidden, forgotten by time, and yet it felt so out of place. It was completely isolated, tucked into a tiny, dark valley. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. Something about it didn't sit right with me. But again, curiosity got the better of me. I made my way toward the shack, keeping to the shadows. The closer I got, the more unsettling it became. The air felt heavier here, thicker. The shack looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The door hung slightly ajar, and there was a faint, sour smell in the air, like old wood and mildew. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave. Another part, the part of me that had pushed on through the woods despite my better judgment, wanted to see what was inside. I stepped closer. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the smell of decay. The floorboards were rotted, and dust covered everything. But there was something more, something strange. On the far side of the shack, a small pile of belongings sat, discarded haphazardly. An old jacket, some crumpled papers, and a strange, faded map pinned to the wall. I couldn't explain why, but the map intrigued me. I reached for it, my hands trembling slightly. It was a map of the region, but the markings on it weren't the usual trail markers. They were different. Circular areas were marked with red ink, with strange symbols drawn inside them. I ran my fingers over one of the markings, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, I heard it, a noise, a soft shuffle behind me. I whipped around, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. But there was nothing there. The shack was empty. Nothing moved. No one stood in the doorway. I forced myself to calm down. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. It was just the isolation, the creeping fear. I had to get out of there. I backed toward the door, my heart racing. As I stepped outside, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, a branch snapping underfoot. I turned, but again, nothing. Panic started to settle in. I needed to leave, but the trail had already vanished into the dark. I was lost. It was late September in 2017 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through a lesser-known part of the San Juan Mountains in southern Colorado. I was 33 years old, had been working a desk job for the past 8 years, and just wanted a break from everything. My name's Marcus Hall, and at that point in my life, I had no wife, no kids, just a quiet apartment in Durango and a lot of built-up stress. I'd done plenty of hiking before, even a couple of solo overnights, but never anything more than 2 days. This time, I planned for 5 full days, carrying all my food and gear on my back, camping each night somewhere along the trail. The idea was to disconnect and get some peace of mind. That didn't happen. I had picked a route I found online in an old hiking forum, a loop that connected a few old mining trails deep in the mountains. It wasn't maintained by the Park Service, and I liked that. Less foot traffic, more quiet. The trail started about 40 minutes outside Silverton, with a narrow dirt road leading to a small pullout where I could leave my car. When I got there early that morning, I didn't see any other cars, which I took as a good sign. I checked my pack, tent, food, water filter, first aid kit, satellite messenger just in case, and started up the path. The first day was perfect. Cool air, dry trail, gold leaves fluttering from the aspens like confetti. I hiked about 10 miles, steadily gaining elevation until I found a small clearing near a stream to pitch my tent. I made some instant rice and beef for dinner, drank filtered water straight from the stream, and fell asleep before it even got dark. That night, the cold woke me up a few times, but nothing unusual. I had done this kind of thing before, but something about the silence out there stuck with me. No crickets, no frogs, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of a branch shifting under its own weight. Still, I slept fine and woke up early the next morning ready to keep going. Day 2 was harder. The trail got steeper, rockier, and less defined. I had to stop more often, check my paper map, and make sure I was still on the right route. Sometimes the trail would disappear into brush or scree, and I'd have to backtrack and look for old cairns. Those little stacks of rocks hikers leave behind to mark the way. I only saw 2 of them the whole day. It started to feel more like bushwhacking than hiking. My legs got scraped by branches and thorns, and I slipped twice on loose rock, but nothing too serious. That night, I camped on a ledge with a view of the valley below, maybe 9,000 feet up. I could see the faint outline of distant ridgelines under the moonlight. Still no sign of anyone else. That's when things started to feel off. I heard something that second night. I had just zipped up my sleeping bag and was about to doze off when I heard a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. I sat up immediately. It didn't sound like a tree creaking in the wind. It was sudden and sharp. Then there was another sound, softer, like something brushing against foliage. I turned off my headlamp and listened in the dark. My heart was already racing, and I tried to calm myself by thinking it was probably a deer, maybe an elk. They were common in this area, but the sounds didn't continue. Nothing moved again after that, at least not that I could hear. I stayed awake for over an hour, just listening. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I looked around the campsite but didn't see any tracks. It was mostly rock and dead leaves, so maybe they wouldn't show. Still, I didn't like it. I packed up quickly and started hiking by first light. My legs were sore from the uphill climbs, and the trail was barely visible now, sometimes disappearing completely for long stretches. I had to check my compass and map constantly. Around midday, I came across what looked like an old mining shack. The roof had collapsed, and the wood was weathered and gray, but part of the frame was still standing. I dropped my pack and poked around it for a bit. Inside, I found rusted cans, old nails, and what might have been a stove or furnace at one point. No signs of life, just decay. I took a long break there, made a cold lunch, and kept going. The path from the shack led downhill into a narrow ravine. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boot prints, but barefoot impressions, deep enough to be fresh. At first, I figured maybe someone else had come through recently, maybe a hunter or another hiker. But who hikes out here barefoot? The prints were uneven, with deep toes and a dragging heel like someone was limping. I followed them for maybe half a mile before they veered off into the underbrush. I stood there for a long time, just staring where they disappeared. My gut told me to keep going. That night, I didn't sleep. I set up camp near a small grove of pines, maybe 6 miles from the shack. As soon as it got dark, I started hearing movement. Not constant, but off and on, soft rustling, twigs snapping, the occasional crunch of leaves. It didn't sound like one animal. It was too irregular, too scattered, like something pacing back and forth, moving in and out of the trees. I laid in my sleeping bag with my knife in one hand and my headlamp in the other. Every time I turned it on, I couldn't see anything past the first row of trees. but the sounds kept coming. At one point, I swear I heard breathing, faint and labored, maybe 30 feet from my tent. Then it stopped. Dead silence. I didn't sleep that night at all. At first light, I broke camp faster than I ever have before. I didn't even eat, just filled my bottle and started hiking. My hands were shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, and every sound in the woods made me flinch. I wanted to finish the loop, get back to the car, and be done with this whole thing. I checked the map again and saw that I could cut about 5 miles off my last day if I left the trail and followed a dry creek bed back to the main road. It wouldn't be easy terrain, but I wanted out fast. That was a mistake. The creek bed started off fine. Mostly gravel, some shallow pools, and smooth rock. But after an hour, the sides of the ravine got steeper. I was boxed in, moving through narrow passages with high walls on either side. The walls were damp, covered in moss and slick rock. The light barely made it in. I couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. And then I found the fire ring. It was in a small clearing where the creek bed widened out. Stones in a circle, blackened with ash, and a few small bones scattered inside. I don't know what kind of bones they were, but they didn't look like anything from a rabbit or squirrel. There were cigarette butts nearby too. Someone had been here. Recently, the ash was still soft. I looked around and saw a makeshift lean-to against the side of the ravine, half hidden behind a pile of brush. Inside were a few pieces of clothing, dirty jeans, a torn jacket, and an old sleeping bag stained and ripped open at the seams. I stood there for a long time, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to search for clues, figure out who had stayed there. The smarter part of me wanted to leave immediately. I chose the second option. I kept moving, faster now, almost jogging through the rocks. My pack bounced on my back, and I nearly twisted my ankle twice. The worst part was that I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. That constant feeling of being watched was stronger now. I stopped turning around. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I made it out of the ravine by late afternoon and found a service road that led back toward where I'd parked. I still had 6 or 7 miles to go. I followed the road as fast as I could, barely stopping to drink water. Then I saw boot prints in the dirt ahead of me, heading the same direction I was going. They weren't mine. I hadn't come this way before, and they were fresh. I slowed down, listening. Nothing. The trees were dense on either side of the road, and the light was starting to fade. I kept walking, heart pounding harder with every step. Then, maybe a mile from my car, I found something that nearly made me throw up. A dead dog, medium-sized, lying in the ditch beside the road. Its body was fresh, no decay yet, but its stomach had been cut open, and its head was missing. No sign of blood anywhere, just the body, clean and quiet like someone had placed it there on purpose. I didn't stop. I walked the last mile straight through, half jogging, not looking at the sides of the road or into the trees. When I saw my car, I almost collapsed. I fumbled the keys, unlocked the door, and threw my pack in the back seat. I didn't even change out of my boots. I just started the engine and drove, not stopping until I hit the highway. Only then did I let myself look in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. I never found out who made those footprints or who stayed in that lean-to. I didn't report it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought no one would believe me. Maybe I didn't want to relive it. All I know is I never hiked alone again. I sold most of my gear a month later and haven't been back to that part of the mountains since. That feeling, being watched, being followed, it stayed with me long after the trip ended. Even now, 8 years later, I still check behind me when I walk through the woods. And I still dream about that creek bed, the fire ring, and the quiet breathing just outside my tent. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was something worse. It was real. I never thought a simple hike would turn into the worst day of my life. It started like any other morning, cool, quiet, the kind of morning that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the dirt path ahead of me. I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo hike through Black Pine Forest, a place I'd been to before but never alone. The trail was supposed to be easy, just a 6-mile loop through dense woods, leading up to a rocky overlook with a view of the valley below. I packed light, a water bottle, some protein bars, a pocket knife, and a first aid kit, just in case. My phone was in my backpack, though I knew service would be spotty. The first few miles were uneventful. Birds chirped, leaves rustled under my boots, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. I felt good, strong, like I could walk forever. Then things changed. I noticed it first in the silence. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died down. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. I slowed my pace, listening. Nothing, just my own breathing and the crunch of twigs under my feet. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. Too big, too deep, like whoever made them was heavy, or carrying something heavy. The prints veered off the main trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I hesitated. Maybe another hiker had gone off path. Maybe it was nothing, but something in my gut told me to turn back. I didn't listen. I kept walking, but now every sound made me jump. A branch snapping somewhere to my left. The distant call of a crow. My heart pounded harder, my palms sweating despite the cool air. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I smelled it, smoke. Not the pleasant kind from a campfire, but thick, acrid, like burning plastic. I followed the scent, my feet moving before my brain could stop them. The trees thinned, and I saw it. A small clearing with a charred circle in the center. The remains of a fire, but not for warmth. Scattered around it were empty cans, torn cloth, and something else. A long, dark stain in the dirt. Blood. My stomach twisted. I took a step back, my boot hitting something solid. A rusted hunting knife, half buried in the dirt. The blade was stained. I ran. Not back the way I came. I was too panicked to think straight. I crashed through the brush, branches whipping at my arms, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Then the ground disappeared beneath me. I fell hard, tumbling down a steep slope, rocks and roots tearing at my clothes. When I finally stopped, pain shot through my ankle. Sprained, maybe broken. I tried to stand, but my leg buckled. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was coming. I dragged myself behind a fallen tree, pressing my back against the rotting wood. My hands shook as I fumbled for my pocket knife. Felt small, useless. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a low, rasping breath. Close, too close. I held mine. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision. Tall, broad-shouldered. A man, dressed in dark, mud-streaked clothes. In his hand, something glinted, a blade, longer than mine. He turned his head, scanning the trees. Waiting. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he walked away. His footsteps faded, but I stayed put for what felt like hours, until the sun dipped low and the forest grew dark. When I was sure he was gone, I crawled. Every inch was agony, but I didn't stop. I followed the slope downward, hoping it would lead to water, to a road, to anything. Then I saw it, a flicker of light through the trees. A cabin. I screamed. Not words, just raw, desperate noise. The door flew open, and an older man stepped out, a rifle in his hands. His eyes locked onto me, widening in shock. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, rushing forward. I passed out before he reached me. When I woke, I was in a hospital. The cops told me they found the man, a drifter with a history of violence. They found other things, too. Things I didn't want to think about. I never went back to Black Pine Forest. Some trails are better left unexplored. It was early autumn, and I had decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Pine Ridge Forest in Colorado. The weather had been unusually warm for the time of year, but I knew it wouldn't last long. I was 29 years old, an avid hiker, and had always enjoyed the solitude of the outdoors. It wasn't that I was trying to escape from anything. I just loved being in nature, away from everything that the modern world had become. I had been preparing for the hike for a while. I had made sure to gather all the necessary gear, checked my maps, and studied the trail details for days beforehand. Pine Ridge was a place that I had heard a lot about. People talked about the wild, untouched beauty of it, how peaceful it was, but there were also whispers. They said people got lost up there, that it was easy to lose track of time. Some even said you could lose track of yourself. I shrugged it off. I wasn't worried. I had plenty of experience with long hikes, and I knew how to navigate the wilderness. Plus, I wasn't one to buy into all the superstitions and rumors that people sometimes latched onto. It was just a trail, trees, rocks, streams. I'd been on tougher ones before. I parked my truck near the trailhead at around 7 a.m., just as the sun was starting to rise. The air was crisp, and a thin mist hung around the trees, giving the forest a faintly eerie glow. Felt good to be there, alone. I took a deep breath, feeling the peace settle in as I tightened my boots and slung my pack over my shoulders. It was going to be a long day, so I made sure to pace myself. The first part of the trail was easy. A wide path cut through thick pines, the ground soft underfoot with fallen needles and dried leaves. The trail followed a small stream for the first few miles, its soft bubbling sound providing a calming background. The sun peeked through the trees as I walked, casting long, dappled shadows across the ground. I paused every now and then to take in the views. The forest was quiet, but not unnervingly so. There was the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird, but it felt like I had the place to myself. The further I walked, the more I began to enjoy the solitude. It gave me time to think, to clear my head. By noon, I reached a point where the trail split. To the left was a more traveled route, which would take me out of the forest and back to a nearby campground in a few hours. But to the right was a much less used path, a small footpath that zigzagged up toward a series of rocky outcroppings. The map didn't show much after that. I knew it would be more rugged, but I had been looking for something more challenging. So I turned right and started the climb. At first, the path was narrow and overgrown. The thick brush tugged at my sleeves, and the air felt denser, heavier. The temperature dropped a few degrees as the trail wound its way upward. The higher I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped chirping, and the wind seemed to have died down. It was unnervingly still. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the elevation. As I reached the first large outcrop of rocks, I decided to take a break. I sat down on a flat rock, pulling out my water bottle and some snacks. The view from here was incredible, stretching miles in every direction. A sea of trees and jagged peaks. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't the forest itself. It was the silence. It felt off, like the world had just stopped. I glanced around, but there was nothing out of place. No animals, no sounds, just the occasional flutter of leaves in the breeze. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I continued on after a short break, following the trail up through the rocks. As I climbed higher, the trees began to thin out. Soon, the only thing around me was jagged stone, and the trail became almost indistinguishable from the rest of the rocky terrain. I was now fully exposed to the sun, but a cool wind had picked up, so it wasn't unbearable. I was used to this type of terrain, so I kept my focus, carefully navigating my way across the rocks. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting an orange glow across the mountainside. I had planned on reaching the top by late afternoon, but as the trail twisted and turned, I realized I had no idea how far I had gone. The markers were sparse, and I hadn't seen another hiker all day. That was unusual, especially for a trail like this. Normally, there would be at least a few people making their way up, but today I hadn't seen a single soul. By the time I reached what I thought was the summit, the sun had almost set. The view was breathtaking, but I didn't linger for long. The wind had picked up, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The weather was turning fast, and I needed to find shelter for the night. I took one last look around before turning to head back down. That's when I noticed something. It was hard to see at first, but there was a faint, dark shape off in the distance, just beyond the rocks. It was so far away that I couldn't make it out clearly, but it seemed off. I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone who had been out here for a while. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, but the figure didn't move. I shook it off. It was probably just the shadows playing tricks on me. After all, it had been a long day, and I was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. But as I made my way down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The figure was still there, standing motionless. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. I didn't want to admit it, but the more I looked back, the more it seemed like the figure was closer. It didn't make sense. I had been at the summit only moments before, and I hadn't heard anyone approaching. No sound of footsteps, no rustling in the brush. Yet, it felt as if someone or something was following me. I stopped for a moment, trying to listen. The wind had died down again, leaving everything eerily quiet. There was no sound but my own breathing. I turned around, scanning the area. Nothing. The figure was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. I was being paranoid, that was all. There was no one else here. I kept walking, trying to push the thought out of my head. As the light faded, I began to feel a growing sense of urgency. The path was getting more treacherous, and I didn't want to be caught on the mountain after dark. I hurried down, but I wasn't familiar with the terrain anymore. The trail had twisted in ways I didn't remember. It wasn't just me. The rocks, the trees, everything looked different. I felt disoriented. And then, as if from nowhere, the figure was back. This time I heard it. A faint rustle, followed by the soft crunch of gravel. It was behind me again, closer than before. I didn't stop to look back this time. My heart was pounding, and every part of me screamed to move faster, to get away. I pushed myself harder, stumbling over rocks, gasping for breath. I needed to get down fast, but the darkness was falling quicker now, and I could barely see. The path was becoming more and more difficult to navigate. My foot caught on a rock, and I went sprawling, scraping my hands on the jagged stone. The pain was sharp, but I didn't stop to tend to it. I pushed myself up and kept going. The figure was still there, just behind me. It was like it was stalking me, not in a hurry, but always just out of reach. And then, without warning, I tripped again. This time, I couldn't catch myself. I tumbled down the rocky slope, rolling, slamming into stones with a sickening crunch. My head spun, and for a moment, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, it was dark. The stars were above me, and the cold had set in. My body ached, and I could barely move, but I could hear someone moving nearby. I turned my head, and for the first time, I saw them clearly. A man, just standing there watching me, but he wasn't moving closer. He wasn't threatening me. He was just there. I wanted to scream, to run, but something in me told me I didn't have to. It was just a person, someone who had come out here like me. He must have heard me fall. "Hey," I whispered, my voice weak. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't answer, but after a long pause, he finally stepped forward and helped me to my feet. The wind howled through the trees as I took the first few steps into the dense forest. My pack, filled with only the bare essentials: water, a first aid kit, snacks, and a map, shifted against my back with every movement, but I didn't mind the weight. It felt good to be out here, away from the constant buzz of my phone and the distractions of city life. The air was fresh, with a sharp bite to it, suggesting that fall had well and truly settled in. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks, a long weekend off from work, and I had chosen a trail that was supposed to be relatively quiet, deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania. It wasn't a well-known path, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no noise, just me and nature. The forecast had called for clear skies, and the temperature was comfortable, not too hot and not too cold. I had mapped out a route that would take me through thick, untouched forest, past streams, and to a secluded overlook where I'd camp for the night. From there, I would head back the next day, a quick and satisfying weekend trip. The trail wasn't too challenging, but it wasn't easy either, which was the way I liked it. Just enough of a challenge to make the journey worthwhile, but not so difficult that I'd be pushing my limits. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the trail narrowed and became less defined. It was clear that not many people ventured this far out, and that was exactly what I was hoping for. I could see signs of wildlife, scrapes on tree trunks, broken branches, and fresh tracks in the dirt. Nothing too concerning, but I was aware that this wasn't the kind of place to let my guard down. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I had planned my timing well and knew that I needed to find a place to set up camp before the light was gone. I started looking for a suitable spot, somewhere flat and dry, preferably near water. I had seen a small stream on my map, just a few miles ahead, and figured it would be perfect. The trail started to descend, and I could hear the sound of running water in the distance. It wasn't long before I found the stream, its clear waters glistening in the last light of day. I set up camp a short distance away, making sure to clear the ground of rocks and sticks before laying down my tent. The firewood I had collected on the way down was enough to keep a small fire going through the evening. As I worked, I could hear the occasional rustle in the trees, and I paused for a moment, wondering what animals might be out there. It was probably just deer, maybe a fox, but the sound still gave me a strange feeling. Once the tent was up and the fire was crackling, I sat down on a log and pulled out my dinner. A simple freeze-dried meal, nothing fancy, but enough to fill me up. I ate slowly, watching the fire dance in the growing darkness. The sky above was an endless sea of stars, brighter than I had ever seen them in the city. The sound of the stream, the crackling fire, and the occasional call of an owl were the only things breaking the silence. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so alone, and it wasn't an uncomfortable feeling. It was peaceful, yet there was a small part of me that couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the knowledge that if something were to go wrong out here, help was hours away. But I shrugged it off. I wasn't a city dweller who had never been in the wild. I had hiked plenty of times before, and I had prepared well for this trip. As night fully settled in, I retreated to my tent. I had planned on reading, but I was already feeling the pull of sleep. The hike had taken more out of me than I realized. I zipped myself into the tent and lay down on the sleeping bag, my mind wandering as I stared at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the world outside. But then, something made me sit up straight. It was faint at first, but there was definitely a noise coming from the woods. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on the dry leaves. I held my breath, straining to listen. Could be anything, probably just an animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be a random animal. It was steady and it was coming closer. I listened for a moment longer. The sound stopped. I relaxed slightly, but then there was a rustle, followed by another set of crunches, this time much closer. My heart began to race. It wasn't an animal. It was something or someone moving on two legs, and it was near my campsite. Panic rose in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. Could be another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost or was just passing through. But the thought of someone out here at this hour made me uneasy. I had seen no one on the trail all day. The noise stopped again, and I lay back down, trying to slow my breathing. I wasn't going to get paranoid. I had just been out here too long. That was all. I needed to sleep, and I couldn't let myself get worked up over nothing. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something else. A faint but unmistakable sound. A low grunt, almost like a growl. My body went rigid. It didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard before. My mind raced, but I couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. I could hear the sound of leaves moving, like something was circling my camp. The growls came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, breathing heavily. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers trembling. I flicked it on, casting a beam of light outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat as I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the circle of light from the fire. Something was moving in the shadows, just out of sight. I wasn't alone. I knew then that I needed to stay calm, to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help. I quietly zipped up the tent and sat back, holding the flashlight in my hand, ready for whatever might come. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. There was something or someone out there, moving slowly around my campsite, breathing heavily. I was alone. There was no one else to help. No one to hear me if I screamed. The weight of that realization hit me like a punch to the gut. But then, just as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. The rustling of leaves, the heavy breathing, all of it disappeared into the night. I sat in the dark, listening intently, but there was no more movement, no more noise, nothing. I stayed in the tent, wide awake, the flashlight still in my hand, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. By that time, the unsettling noises had stopped completely, and I was left with the eerie silence of the forest. I didn't know if it had been a person or an animal, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. The rest of the morning was uneventful. I packed up my gear quickly, keeping my eyes peeled for anything unusual. There was no sign of anyone or anything near my camp. The only trace of what had happened was the feeling that something had been watching me the entire night. As I made my way back down the trail, the sun breaking through the trees, I realized that I would never forget the feeling of those moments in the dark, alone, with something or someone, just out of sight. It's funny how quickly your mind can turn something peaceful into something terrifying. A simple hike in the woods can quickly become something else entirely when you're isolated, when you don't have the certainty of what's around you. I don't know what I experienced out there, but I'll tell you one thing. Next time I go hiking, I won't be so eager to be alone. I was just happy to get back to the car. I don't think I'll go back to those woods anytime soon. Not alone, at least. It was early in the morning, and the air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light over the mountainside. I stood at the trailhead, adjusting the straps on my backpack, the weight of it pressing gently against my shoulders. The plan was simple. I would hike to the summit of Mount Blackstone, a challenging, yet manageable trail known for its breathtaking views. The weather forecast had promised a clear day, which was a good sign, considering I was hiking alone. I had always been someone who preferred solitude. The quiet of the wilderness had a calming effect on me, a peace that I couldn't find in the noise of everyday life. I hadn't taken a proper hike in months, and I was looking forward to this day, just me, the trail, and my thoughts. The trail was narrow at first, barely wide enough for one person to walk comfortably. The dirt was soft underfoot, and the occasional rock or root poked up to trip me if I wasn't paying attention. I adjusted my pace, settling into a rhythm as the trail started to climb. To my left, thick trees blocked out much of the light, their branches intertwining overhead like a canopy. The forest felt alive, the chirping of birds and rustling of leaves the only sounds that filled the air. The occasional breeze swept through, carrying with it the smell of fresh pine and moss. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I moved deeper into the forest, my breathing slow and steady. The path ahead was unclear, hidden by dense foliage, but I could just make out the faint outline of rocks and the occasional signpost marking the way. I had done my research and knew this trail well enough, but there was always a sense of uncertainty in the wild, a reminder that nature wasn't something you could control. About an hour into the hike, the trail began to steepen. The trees thinned out, and the terrain became more rugged, with large boulders scattered along the path. I stopped briefly to catch my breath, taking in the view of the valley below. The landscape stretched for miles, the forest giving way to rolling hills that seemed to disappear into the horizon. It was peaceful, a vast emptiness that made everything feel small. I resumed my climb, my legs burning slightly with each step, but the feeling of being alive in this remote place pushed me forward. The trail wound around rocks and tree roots, growing steeper with each passing minute. By the time I reached the first overlook, I was sweating, my clothes clinging to my skin. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand and took a sip from my water bottle, the cold water refreshing my dry throat. As I sat there, gazing out over the mountains, a strange thought crossed my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a strong sensation, just a fleeting awareness, like when you feel someone watching you. But as I scanned the area, I saw no sign of anyone. There was only the endless expanse of forest, stretching out beneath the sky. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, hiking alone often left me with more time to think than I was used to, and my mind had a tendency to wander. I spent another hour climbing, slowly but surely making my way up the mountain. The trees had completely disappeared now, replaced by rocky outcroppings and patches of scrubby brush. The air was thinner up here, and I noticed my breath coming in shorter bursts. But the summit was within reach, and that was enough to keep me moving. By the time I reached the top, the sun was fully risen, and the world below was bathed in a warm, golden glow. The view was even more spectacular than I had imagined. The valley below seemed like a patchwork quilt of green and brown, the trees arranged in neat rows, their tops brushing against the sky. The distant peaks of other mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged outlines contrasting sharply with the softness of the clouds. I set down my pack and took a moment to simply stand there, taking it all in. The wind was cold up here, but it didn't bother me. I felt a sense of accomplishment, of having reached this place that few others ever would. It was peaceful, until the silence was broken by the sound of something scraping against a rock. My body froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind or a bird, but something else. My first instinct was to turn around, but I stopped myself, uncertain of what I might find. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the area behind me, but there was nothing. For a few moments, I stood perfectly still, straining my ears, trying to hear anything that would explain the noise. But the wind had picked up, rustling the dry grasses around me and making it difficult to hear anything clearly. I shook my head. It was probably nothing. A falling rock, maybe, or an animal in the distance. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and decided it was time to start the descent. The way down was just as steep as the way up, if not more so. The trail, such as it was, seemed to disappear in places, leaving me to navigate a series of loose rocks and uneven ground. I moved slowly, careful not to lose my footing, the weight of my pack making every step feel like a little more effort. The sound of my boots crunching against the gravel was the only thing that filled the air, and I found it oddly comforting. As I descended, I passed through areas I hadn't noticed on the way up, hidden valleys and clusters of trees that seemed to spring out of nowhere. The further I went, the more disorienting the terrain became. The path was hard to follow, and I began to doubt my sense of direction. There had been moments on the way up where I had second-guessed the trail, but now it felt like I was in unfamiliar territory. That was when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were my own. Perhaps I had missed a spot when I came up. But as I looked closer, I saw that they were fresh, the soil still disturbed, the edges sharp and crisp. They were larger than mine, deep imprints that suggested the person who had made them was heavier, possibly taller. They didn't look like a typical hiker's print either. The shape was wrong, too irregular, too off-center. It was as if someone had walked here recently, but with a deliberate care to avoid being seen. My heart began to race. I had told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just imagining things, but the feeling that I wasn't alone had crept back into my thoughts. I stopped walking, my eyes scanning the area around me, trying to discern any signs of movement or another person. There was nothing, just trees, rocks, and the quiet hum of the forest. But the footprints were still there, leading down the trail. I took a few more steps, my mind reeling. Was someone else on the trail with me? Maybe they had passed through earlier, and I hadn't noticed. But why hadn't I heard them? It didn't make sense. The sense of unease only deepened as I continued on. The footprints seemed to continue ahead of me, always a few steps in front, as though someone had been walking just ahead of me for hours. I moved faster, my pace quickening as my anxiety built. My breathing grew shallow, and my mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening. I could hear the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the trail opened up. The trees parted, and I was standing in a wide clearing. The tension in my chest began to ease, but something was still off. I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. There was nothing there, no sign of another person, no movement, nothing out of place. The sense of relief I had been waiting for never came. Instead, I was left with a gnawing feeling in my gut that told me I wasn't alone. But I couldn't explain why. I stood there for a moment longer, trying to gather my thoughts. The footprints had stopped here, and that fact unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Where had the person gone? And why had they left no trace of themselves beyond those footprints? At that moment, I knew I needed to get back to the trailhead. Something about this place felt wrong, and I didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. The hike down had become something else entirely, a sense of urgency taking over as I retraced my steps. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the stillness, the forest eerily quiet as I moved. I reached the trailhead just before sunset, my legs aching from the descent. The last rays of light were slipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. As I reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't sure what I had experienced, or if it had all been in my head, but I had made it out of there safely. I threw my pack into the back of the car and climbed into the driver's seat. As I drove away, the trees fading into the distance behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain why. It was a Saturday morning in mid-October when I decided to take a hike along a trail I'd never explored before. I had been working long hours at a tech startup, and the weight of stress was beginning to wear me thin. My name's Andrew, and I was 28 years old. I've always enjoyed being outdoors, but recently, between the grind of work and my cramped apartment in the city, I'd hardly had time to appreciate nature the way I used to. This weekend, I was determined to disconnect. No phones, no emails, no distractions. Just me, my backpack, and the woods. The trail I picked was in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, Canada. I had been recommended it by a friend who said it was beautiful but not overly crowded. Perfect for someone like me, who wasn't quite a seasoned hiker but still enjoyed a good challenge. The morning was chilly, with a crisp bite to the air, but nothing that couldn't be solved by layering up. I parked my car at the trailhead around 8:30 a.m. The forest stretched out in every direction, the towering pines and thick underbrush creating a quiet, almost sacred space. The trail was narrow, winding through the trees, and it looked well-maintained, though not overdone. Just the way I liked it. I double-checked my gear, water, snacks, a compass, and a first aid kit, and I was off. The first part of the hike was easy, a steady incline that felt good on my legs after the long drive. My boots crunched over the fallen leaves, and I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. It was peaceful. I didn't see anyone else at first, just the solitude of the wilderness, which felt oddly comforting. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sky above was a faded blue, dotted with a few lingering clouds. There was something calm and reassuring about it. The forest around me seemed almost timeless, with its thick canopy and the sounds of birds chirping far above. It was exactly what I needed to clear my head. But as I continued up the trail, the atmosphere began to shift. The sun broke through the trees in sporadic bursts, casting strange, long shadows that made the forest feel a little less inviting. The trail became steeper, the ground rougher, and the sounds of wildlife started to fade. It wasn't that the forest was silent. It was more like the usual noises had been muffled, as if the trees themselves were absorbing every sound. It made me feel as if I was in a place where I didn't belong, like the woods were watching me. I pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I'd hiked in plenty of remote places before. The quiet was something you just had to get used to. The further I went, the more it felt like the trail was growing narrower, the trees closing in around me. I checked my map. Everything seemed fine. There was a fork up ahead, the trail splitting into two paths. The sign said both paths led to the same place, but one was a shorter route that looped back around. The other was longer, winding up into the hills. I figured I'd take the longer route. I didn't mind the extra exercise. I pushed forward, The sounds of the forest almost gone now, replaced by the occasional creak of trees swaying in the wind. But it was strange, there wasn't much wind at all. The leaves barely stirred, and the air felt dense, almost too still. I noticed something odd after a while. There were no other hikers. The trail was supposed to be popular, and yet not a single person had passed me by. I wasn't exactly worried, but the emptiness of it all started to feel off. I looked around again, trying to reassure myself. The trees stood tall and silent. The only movement was from the occasional squirrel skittering up the trunk of a nearby pine. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around noon, I came across a small clearing. The sun finally broke through, and for the first time in hours, the forest was illuminated. The sky was clear, the blue almost unreal against the deep green of the trees. I took a seat on a fallen log to rest and grab a snack. I had brought some jerky, a couple of protein bars, and a bottle of water. I ate slowly, taking in the surroundings. The view from the clearing was beautiful, nothing but rolling hills and dense forest in every direction. The air was cool, and there was something refreshing about the solitude. But the longer I sat there, the more I began to feel that same discomfort creeping back. I decided to move on. Something in the back of my mind was urging me to keep going, to finish the trail and not stop until I reached the end. So I packed up my things, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started moving again. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had grown darker somehow. The sun was higher in the sky, but the trees were so thick that the light barely reached the ground. The path ahead grew steeper, and the ground was rocky, making each step a little more challenging. Still, I pushed forward. That's when I heard it, the crunch of twigs behind me. At first, I thought it was just another animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though that seemed unlikely. The sound was too distinct, too deliberate. It was followed by a rustling in the bushes to my left. I stopped, holding my breath, trying to listen. The forest had always felt so quiet before, but now the silence felt oppressive. I waited, straining to hear any movement, but the sound didn't come again. I shook my head. I was being paranoid. This was just the wilderness, after all. Animals were always moving around. But then there was another sound, this time from ahead. A heavy thud, like something large had dropped onto the ground. My heart rate spiked. I shouldn't have been so far out here on my own, I thought. I should have stayed closer to the main trail. I looked around, trying to see through the thick undergrowth, but the trees were too dense. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I began walking again, faster now, feeling the pressure in my chest as if I was being watched. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. The trail was beginning to feel unfamiliar. The trees felt taller, the path more erratic. Something didn't sit right with me. My footsteps felt too loud, and the air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay. I checked my map once more. Something was off. I was supposed to be near the ridge by now, but the trail had become unrecognizable. I retraced my steps for a while, hoping to find some sort of landmark. Nothing. As I made my way back, I stumbled over something, roots tangled up in the earth. I cursed under my breath, and when I straightened up, I saw something in the distance. A structure, a small wooden cabin, partially obscured by the trees. It wasn't on the map. I hadn't seen any signs indicating a building along the trail. The curiosity piqued me, and despite every instinct telling me not to approach it, I found myself walking toward it. My mind was racing with questions. Who built it? Why was it here? Had anyone been living here? I wasn't sure, but something in me told me to check it out. I reached the cabin cautiously. It was old, weathered, with moss growing along the sides. The door was cracked open. I hesitated, my hand on the handle. The cabin looked abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, might be inside. I took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust. It looked like no one had been here for years. Old furniture was scattered around. An overturned chair, a rickety table, and a fireplace covered in soot. But what caught my eye was a small leather journal lying on the table. I stepped closer, curiosity gnawing at me. I opened the journal, flipping through the yellowed pages. The writing was erratic, scribbled hastily. I couldn't make sense of it at first, but as I read further, my heart sank. The entries spoke of someone trapped in the forest, unable to find their way out, and they grew more frantic with each page. The last entry was dated only a few days ago. That's when I heard the footsteps again. It was a cool, early autumn morning in the Appalachian Mountains. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky in a pale, soft orange, a contrast to the deep blue that clung to the horizon. I was in my mid-20s, tall with shaggy brown hair and a decent enough level of fitness from hiking often. It was a Thursday, and I'd taken the day off from work to get away from the city and clear my head. I hadn't been hiking in a while, and the idea of spending a full day on a trail with no distractions sounded like the perfect way to unwind. I drove my old Subaru out of the small town where I'd grown up, the engine humming as I wound my way along the narrow mountain roads. The leaves were starting to change colors, though it was still mostly green. The roads became bumpier the higher I climbed, and I started to feel the isolation setting in. My phone was nearly out of service, and I'd lost signal hours ago. For the first time, I felt the weight of being truly alone. By the time I reached the trailhead, the only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant murmur of water running in the nearby creek. The parking lot was empty, which suited me just fine. I wasn't looking to see anyone, not even a hiker. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my gear, water, snacks, a map, a flashlight, and a first aid kit, and adjusted the straps on my boots. Everything felt ready, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that this hike was going to be different. The trail was narrow at first, a soft carpet of fallen leaves beneath my feet. It wasn't difficult, not at all. In fact, the path wound gently up the mountain, with the trees towering on both sides, their branches filtering the sunlight into a patchwork of soft shadows. Birds called out occasionally, their sounds echoing through the forest. There was a refreshing coolness to the air, mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. The first few miles were uneventful. The forest was quiet, as if holding its breath. I stopped once or twice to take in the view from small ridgelines, looking down at the valley below, where the creek twisted like a ribbon through the forest. There was something peaceful about the place, and I began to feel my mind clearing, the tension from work and city life slowly unwinding with each step. But after a few hours, I noticed a change. The trail became steeper, the undergrowth thicker. The trees seemed to close in around me, their bark rough against the backdrop of green and gold. There were fewer birds now, and I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. The woods were no longer peaceful but heavy, oppressive. It wasn't that I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't pinpoint it, but something about the silence felt off. I tried to shake it off, pushing myself to go further. But the longer I walked, the more it felt like I was trudging through some forgotten corner of the wilderness. The path seemed to grow narrower, and I started to notice how few markings there were. No trail signs, no mile markers, just the same winding path through the thick trees. Eventually, the trail forked, and I had to make a choice. One path looked well-worn, the dirt darkened with use, and the other was overgrown, the grass higher than my knees. The well-worn path seemed the safer bet, so I took it, but something nagged at me. I couldn't remember seeing any trail maps that mentioned a fork. Was it possible I had taken a wrong turn? I checked the map, but it wasn't very clear. The lines were faint and sometimes hard to follow, especially under the thick canopy of trees. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a clear trail marker either. The doubt started creeping in. I'd passed by a few deadfall trees, their branches stripped bare. The sound of water had been distant for a while now. In fact, everything felt distant. The chirping of insects, the rustling of the wind, even the creaking of the trees. It was as if the forest itself was retreating from me, leaving only this narrow path behind. By late afternoon, I found myself at the base of a rocky outcrop. The trail had vanished entirely, leaving me standing in front of a wall of boulders and jagged stone. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to climb up, hoping for some sort of view to help me orient myself. My hands scraped against the rough stone as I pulled myself up. Each movement seemed to echo in the silence, and I began to feel as if the world had shrunk to nothing more than this rock and me. When I finally reached the top, my heart sank. There was no recognizable view, no grand vista over the valley, no distant peaks, just a small clearing surrounded by thick, unbroken forest. I couldn't see anything beyond the dense trees, and the sinking feeling in my stomach deepened. How had I gotten so far off track? The sun was starting to dip, the sky growing darker by the minute. I decided to head back down, retracing my steps, but it didn't take long before I realized I had no idea where the trail had gone. The path was gone, swallowed by the forest. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I scanned the surroundings, looking for any familiar landmarks, any sign that I hadn't veered completely off course. The trees were all the same, tall and dark and imposing. The air was growing colder, and I knew I needed to make a decision fast. I couldn't keep wandering around aimlessly. I checked my phone again, but there was no signal. The battery was low too, and I didn't want to waste it. I had a compass, though, so I decided to use that to try and head south, which was the direction I knew would take me back to the trailhead. The terrain was rougher now, filled with sharp rocks and uneven ground. The forest closed in even tighter, the trees becoming denser and the underbrush thicker. The chill in the air made my breath visible, and the wind began to pick up, rustling the branches above me. The path I had been following was almost entirely gone now, and the forest was silent again, except for the occasional sound of a twig snapping underfoot. As the evening began to descend into full night, my mind started to play tricks on me. Every sound was amplified: the rustling of leaves, the crackling of branches, the distant eerie howl of wind through the trees. There was no moon yet, and the darkness in the forest felt complete. I switched on my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the thick night. I pressed on, trying to stay calm, but my head was starting to spin. I had no idea how far I had gone or in which direction I was moving. Every tree looked the same. The shadows seemed to shift. My pulse quickened, and I found myself stumbling over roots, trying to push through the growing panic in my chest. Then, through the gloom, I saw something. A flicker of light, faint but noticeable, in the distance. My heart skipped. Was it another hiker? Maybe someone else lost like me? Or was it something else? Something that I couldn't quite explain. The darkness pressed in closer, and I was compelled to move toward the light, despite the unease that gnawed at me. As I neared, the light grew brighter, and I began to make out shapes in the darkness. An old, weather-beaten cabin. It was small and modest, almost hidden by the dense trees. The door was cracked open, and a soft light flickered from within. I paused, my breath coming fast, unsure whether to approach or turn back. Something made me go forward, though. Desperation, maybe, or curiosity. I stepped closer, moving cautiously. The light was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, dark woods around me. As I reached the door, I knocked, but there was no answer. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my feet. The cabin was empty, not a soul inside, but it wasn't abandoned. There were signs of life: a fire burning in the hearth, a half-finished meal on the table, and a small, worn cot in the corner. It was as if someone had just stepped out. I didn't understand. It was too quiet, too eerie. The cabin seemed like it had been waiting for me. The air smelled of wood smoke and something older, but I was grateful to be there, away from the endless, oppressive forest. I spent the night in that cabin, and the next morning, I woke to the sound of birds singing and the sunlight streaming through the small window. The forest was still there, but it didn't feel as suffocating anymore. Somehow, I had found my way out of the wilderness, if only for a while. The door creaked open, and I stepped back into the forest, more cautious now, but a little more at peace. The trailhead wasn't far off, and I knew that the next time I ventured out into these mountains, I would be far more aware of how easily the woods could pull you in, trap you, and leave you to wonder if you'd ever find your way out. As I walked back down the trail, I realized how close I'd come to losing myself in the forest. But the daylight brought clarity, and the warmth of the sun on my skin helped clear the last traces of fear. I had survived, and I would be more careful next time. The path home was clear, and the woods no longer felt as vast and uninviting. Maybe that's what I needed all along. A little reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, and how important it was to trust your instincts, stay aware, and never forget the power of the wild. The sun was low in the sky when I started up the trail. Black Ridge was supposed to be an easy hike, just a few miles up, a clear view from the top, then back down before dark. I checked the weather, packed enough water, told a friend where I was going. Everything should have been fine. But now, as the trees thickened and the path narrowed, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in over 20 minutes. I stopped, breathing hard, and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The air was cooler here, damp with the smell of pine and wet earth. My boots crunched over dead leaves as I turned in a slow circle, searching for anything familiar. Nothing, just the same endless stretch of trees, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. Swearing under my breath, I shoved it back into my pocket and kept walking. The trail had to be here somewhere. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, strayed onto a game path. It happened. I just had to stay calm, retrace my steps. But the deeper I went, the less the forest looked like the one I'd started in. The trees were taller, their trunks gnarled and dark. The underbrush clawed at my legs as I pushed through, thorns snagging my jeans. My breath came faster, my heart beat loud in my ears. Then I heard it. A snap, not the usual rustle of an animal, not the wind. Something bigger, something moving with purpose. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves underfoot. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. My fingers tightened around the strap of my backpack. I had a knife in there, small but sharp. Not that it would matter if whatever was behind me decided to. Another step. Closer. I spun around. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, the fading light. But the air felt heavier now, thick with the scent of something musky and wild. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the brush, my lungs burning. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. Then the ground disappeared beneath me. I fell hard, tumbling down a steep slope, rocks and roots tearing at my clothes. The world spun, pain exploding in my side as I slammed into something solid. When I finally stopped, I was lying on my back, staring up at the sky. Dusk had settled in, the first stars blinking to life. My whole body ached, but I forced myself to sit up. That's when I saw the cabin. Small, old, its wooden walls weathered gray. The door hung slightly open, swaying in the breeze. I should have turned away, should have kept running, but the thought of shelter, of somewhere to hide, was too strong. I limped toward it. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust. A single chair lay overturned in the corner, a rusted lantern on the table. And then I saw the blood. Dark stains smeared across the floor, leading to a door at the back of the room. My stomach twisted. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. I had to leave, now. But before I could move, the door creaked open. A man stood there, tall, gaunt, his clothes ragged. His eyes locked onto mine, empty and cold. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I ran, out the door, back into the trees, my legs screaming in protest. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Somehow I found the trail again. Or maybe it found me. The trees thinned, the path widened, and then headlights. A road. A truck slowed as I stumbled onto the asphalt. The driver's face pale with shock as he took in my torn clothes, my bleeding hands. I didn't speak as I climbed in, didn't explain. As the truck pulled away, I finally looked back at the forest. And in the distance, just for a second, I saw him, watching, waiting, but I was gone. I was 35 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. It was early October 2019, right before the snow started setting in, but late enough in the season that the trails were quiet. I had taken time off work after a long contract ended. I wanted silence, nature, and time away from my phone. No distractions. Just me, my pack, and the trail. I spent weeks preparing. I read topographic maps, checked weather forecasts, and packed carefully. I had a GPS beacon, a good compass, printed maps, and backup batteries. My backpack was loaded with enough food for 10 days, a water filtration system, a first aid kit, and all the gear I thought I'd need. I'd hiked alone before, but nothing as long or isolated as this. My plan was to do a loop starting at a trailhead near Lake Como and moving northwest into the more remote ridges, camping along the way, then circling back south. I estimated 7 to 9 days total, depending on conditions. On the morning I left, the sky was a dull gray. The forecast had said light rain the first 2 days, followed by clearer skies. I didn't mind a little rain. I had a good rain shell and a dry pack. The first few hours were uneventful. I moved through low forest and old, wide trails. There were signs of other hikers, boot prints in the soft dirt, an old cigarette butt, even a bandana tied to a branch like a marker. The further I got from the main trail, the quieter it became. By the end of the first day, I had reached a small alpine meadow where I set up my tent beside a creek. I boiled water, ate some freeze-dried pasta, and read a little from the paperback I'd brought. It rained lightly through the night, tapping gently against the nylon of my tent, but I stayed warm and dry. Everything felt normal. Day 2 was steeper. The trail narrowed as I climbed higher into the range. I passed through deadfall and rock slides, took my time crossing a narrow ravine, and started to see less and less sign of anyone else. Around midday, I took a break under a rock overhang to eat and refill my water. That's when I realized how little I'd seen or heard of other people since the morning before. No planes overhead, no distant hum of traffic, just wind and birds and the crunch of my boots. Felt peaceful. That night I camped near a frozen pond. The trees were thin up here, mostly scrubby pines and twisted brush. I made a small fire using dry twigs and wood I found under rocks. I watched the flames and let my mind drift. I didn't feel afraid or lonely. Not yet. It was on the 3rd day that things started to feel off. I had crossed into higher ground and was navigating a steep set of switchbacks. The trail wasn't as well maintained here. Erosion had carved deep grooves through some of the turns. The trees were thicker in places and dead quiet. I remember stopping once, breathing hard after a tough climb, and suddenly noticing how still everything was. No wind, no birds, not even the creak of trees. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off and kept moving. I had miles to go. My goal was to reach a small clearing marked on the map, near the edge of a narrow ridge. From there, the trail looped south again. I didn't make it. Mid-afternoon, clouds moved in again. Dark ones. The air got heavier. I felt it in my lungs and behind my eyes. I picked up the pace, hoping to reach the clearing before the rain came. The switchbacks grew sharper, the trail cutting tighter along the ridge. One wrong step and I'd be down a rocky slope. That's when I noticed the trail was changing. Subtle things. The ground was softer, like it hadn't been packed down by boots in a long time. Grass was growing in the center. The brush was more overgrown. I stopped and checked the map. My compass said I was still on course, but something felt off. I looked around and tried to orient myself with the surrounding ridges, but the cloud cover was too thick to get a good look. I figured the trail was just less traveled up here. No big deal. I kept going. Then I saw it, just off the trail, maybe 30 yards into the trees. Something white. I walked closer and found what looked like an old hiking boot, half buried under pine needles and dirt. I pulled it free. It was cracked and rotting. The sole was mostly gone. Inside was the brittle remains of what looked like fabric and maybe bone. A small piece. I dropped it fast. My stomach turned. I backed away and looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of how deep I was into the woods. I told myself it could have been a very old shoe. Maybe an animal dragged it there. But there was something about the way it was lying there, half buried, out of sight, like it had been forgotten. I decided to keep going, quicker now. I wanted to reach that clearing before dark, but the trail seemed to get worse. Roots, rocks, unstable ground. I slipped more than once. My knee twisted slightly on one fall, but I pushed through. I just wanted to set up camp and regroup. I never found the clearing. What I found instead was a steep slope that dropped sharply into thick forest. The trail disappeared entirely. It just ended. No fork, no signs, just stopped. I stood there for a while, confused. I checked my compass again, checked the map. According to both, I should have still been on the loop trail, but the terrain didn't match anymore. There was no sign of the ridge I was supposed to be following. No elevation drop like I was seeing. Something was wrong. I turned back the way I'd come, planning to retrace my steps. But within 10 minutes, I couldn't find the same switchbacks. Everything looked different. The trees weren't the same. The slope was gentler here, and the ground had different kinds of moss. I wasn't on the same trail anymore. I spent the rest of that afternoon trying to find my way back. I moved slowly, marking trees with small pieces of tape and checking my compass every 5 minutes. But every direction seemed wrong. I couldn't get the map to line up with what I was seeing. My GPS beacon still had signal, so I marked my position, hoping I could figure it out later. I set up camp on a flat spot between two large trees. I didn't eat much that night. I sat in my tent, staring at the map until my head hurt. It rained hard that night. Wind shook the tent. I didn't sleep much. Day 4 was worse. I woke up early, packed fast, and tried again to find the trail. I moved in wide arcs, trying to loop back to any familiar ground. But nothing looked right. It was like the forest had shifted overnight. At one point, I came across a narrow game trail. I followed it for over an hour, hoping it would lead me back to a main path. Didn't. It just curved around a low ridge and ended in a mess of tangled brush. I realized I was properly lost. Not just off trail, completely turned around. My food would last another 5 or 6 days if I rationed. Water was less of an issue. I had streams and a filter. But the idea of being stuck out here without finding my way back started to hit me hard. I kept moving. That night, I camped on a slope. It was damp, cold, and miserable. I kept hearing noises, cracks, small thumps, brush rustling. I told myself it was animals, just deer or elk, maybe a bear. I'd hung my food far from the tent, took every precaution. Still, I barely slept. I kept imagining things out there, just beyond the tent walls. The next 2 days blurred together. I wandered more than hiked. The forest got denser. My legs were scraped from branches. I started to get blisters on both feet. I stopped using the map entirely. It didn't match anything anymore. I relied on my compass, trying to move steadily south. I figured if I kept going in one direction long enough, I'd hit a road or a river or something. On day 6, I found the cabin. I was walking along a dry creek bed when I saw the roof through the trees. Rusted metal partially collapsed on one side. The structure was small, maybe 15 feet across, made of gray logs gone soft with rot. I approached slowly, unsure if anyone might be there, but it was clearly abandoned. The door hung open. Inside was a single room with a broken cot, a rusted stove, and a few old cans on a shelf. Dust coated everything. In one corner was a crate with some tools, most of them broken or rusted beyond use. A cracked lantern, pair of old snowshoes. I checked every inch. Nothing useful. No maps, no food, no batteries. Just old trash. I found initials carved into one beam, WL 1982, and an old photo pinned to the wall with a nail. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of what looked like the same cabin. Both were smiling. The edges of the photo were curled from damp. I sat on the floor for a long time. It was the first real shelter I'd found in days, and for a while, it gave me some hope. I thought maybe I could follow whatever old trail led to this place and find my way out. But there wasn't one. I circled the cabin in wide loops. No trail, no road, just thick forest. I stayed the night there. It was colder, but at least I had walls. I lit a small fire in the stove using dry twigs and bark. It smoked heavily but kept me warm. My name's Darren Beckett. I was 33 years old when this happened, back in the fall of 2016. I lived in Flagstaff, Arizona, working as a freelance web designer, mostly out of coffee shops and my one-bedroom apartment. I wasn't athletic or anything, but I'd gotten into hiking a few years earlier as a way to clear my head after staring at screens all day. Started with short day hikes, nothing serious. But over time, I started going deeper, farther out, staying overnight sometimes. I liked the quiet, the open space, and being away from everyone. There's something about the desert that humbles you. That September, I had a week with no projects lined up, so I decided to head out solo. I'd heard about this little-used trail down in the Sycamore Canyon Wilderness, southwest of Sedona, and just outside the more popular routes. A guy I met in a gear shop mentioned it to me. He said, "If you want solitude, try Hidden Gulch." That's what he called it. I never found it on any official map. It was supposed to be a narrow, dry wash that cut off from the main canyon and ran for a few miles before dead-ending into a box canyon with steep sandstone walls. He said hardly anyone ever went out there. No official trail markers, just a vague footpath. That's what drew me to it. I packed light, maybe too light, a 40-liter pack, a tarp shelter, sleeping bag, a few mountain house meals, and about 5 liters of water in 2 bladders and 1 Nalgene. I had a topo map of the general area, a compass, and my phone with GPS, though there's almost never signal out there. I also brought a small first aid kit, a headlamp, a pocket knife, and a small titanium stove with fuel. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, and this one didn't look too complicated. I planned for 2 nights out, maybe 3 if I really wanted to soak it in. I parked my car at a little pull-off along FR 525, just past where the pavement turns to dirt. There were no other cars and no signs, just dusty brush and the sound of wind blowing across flat rock. I locked my car, threw on my pack, and started walking down what looked like an old ATV trail. It was around 9:30 in the morning. The sun was already hot, but it was dry, and there was a cool breeze out of the west. After a mile or so, I cut off the main wash and followed a smaller, narrower canyon. This was supposed to be the entrance to Hidden Gulch. It wasn't marked, but I could see faint footprints in the sand, maybe a few weeks old, and the way the rocks curved inward seemed to match the directions I remembered. The walls started to rise higher, and the canyon narrowed until it was maybe 20 feet wide, with steep cliffs on either side. It was beautiful in a rugged way, the kind of place where you don't hear anything except the crunch of your boots and the occasional buzz of insects. I passed patches of desert grass, a few scraggly juniper trees clinging to life on the walls, and some bleached animal bones half buried in the sand. Probably a deer. I saw some scat too, maybe bobcat or coyote. Nothing fresh, nothing to worry about. The farther I went, the more I felt like I was somewhere that no one had touched in a long time. I walked maybe 7 miles that first day. I took my time, stopping to take photos, sip water, and check the map. Around 3 p.m., I found a flat sandy patch tucked beneath a rock overhang, a good spot to make camp. The canyon here was tighter, with a single scrubby mesquite tree growing out of a crack in the wall. I set up my tarp shelter, made a small rock ring for my stove, and heated some water for dinner. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the sliver of sky above the canyon. The stars were sharp and bright. No planes, no noise, nothing. Just me and the rocks. It was peaceful in a way I can't describe unless you've been alone in a place like that. I woke up around 5 a.m. the next morning to the sound of something moving nearby. Not loud, just the sound of small rocks shifting. I sat up slowly, heart already beating faster. I listened, holding my breath. Came again like a footstep, then nothing. I turned on my headlamp and scanned the darkness. The light bounced off the canyon walls and through strange shadows. I didn't see anything. Maybe a critter, maybe the wind. I stayed still for a while, then lay back down, though I didn't sleep much after that. By 7 a.m., I was up and moving. Ate a granola bar, packed up camp, and kept going farther into the gulch. The walls got steeper, the path narrower. At one point, I had to scramble over a pile of fallen rocks where the wash had eroded. There were deep shadows in the cracks between the stones. I kept thinking about those footsteps. Around midday, I reached what I figured was the end of the gulch. The walls rose straight up for over 100 feet, and the canyon floor was littered with broken boulders and sun-bleached sticks. There were signs of old flash floods, debris caught high in the branches of a dead tree, mud stains on the rock wall 10 feet off the ground. I dropped my pack and took a break. The air was still. I didn't like how quiet it was. There's a kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. That's what it felt like. Then I saw something strange. On the far side of the canyon, half buried in sand and rock, was what looked like a tattered piece of blue nylon. I walked over and brushed away some debris. It was the remains of a tent, shredded and sun-bleached. Next to it, I found the melted base of a plastic water bottle and a rusted zipper pull. No bones, no clothes, nothing else. But it wasn't that old. Maybe a few years. That changed the tone of the trip fast. I backed away slowly, looking around. I didn't like that someone else had camped out here and left in such a hurry they abandoned gear. People don't just walk away from a tent unless something bad happens. I decided not to stay there that night. I turned back, planning to hike back toward the mouth of the gulch and find a new campsite closer to the exit. I walked fast, barely stopping. Every rock and shadow felt like it was watching me. My heart was racing, and I kept checking behind me. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. About a mile down, I saw fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were from a different pair of boots, wider tread, deeper impressions. They were ahead of me on the trail, leading in the same direction I was going. Someone had been, or still was, out here. I stopped cold, looked around. Nothing moved, no sound. I had two options. Keep following the gulch out, hoping they weren't a threat, or climb out of the canyon and try to bushwhack back to the road overland. I didn't like either one, but I chose the latter. The idea of following someone or being followed along a narrow canyon didn't sit right. I scrambled up the sidewall where there was a break in the rock. It took everything I had to pull myself up the steep incline with my pack. My hands got cut, and my legs were shaking by the time I reached the rim. The view stretched out for miles. Hills, mesas, dry grasslands. I used the sun to orient myself and started walking west, figuring I'd intersect with the old ATV road eventually. It was hard going. No trail, just cactus, loose rocks, and the constant paranoia that someone might still be watching me from below. I didn't stop to eat. I drank little. I just moved. After a couple of hours, I reached a rise where I could look back at the canyon. That's when I saw the figure. He was standing near the edge of the wash, maybe 100 yards back, dressed in dark clothing, arms at his sides. I couldn't make out any features. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I ducked, heart in my throat. I crawled behind a boulder and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Peeked again. He was gone. I didn't know what to think. Had he seen me? Was he following me? Or had I imagined it? I kept moving. By sundown, I still hadn't reached the road. My legs were raw from thorns, my water was almost gone, and the wind had picked up. I found a flat spot beneath a bluff and made camp without a fire. I didn't even bother setting up my tarp. I just curled up in my bag and waited out the night, ears straining for any sound. At one point, around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps again, on gravel nearby. I sat up, knife in hand, heart pounding. I waited. Nothing. Then the wind kicked up again, blowing dust into my face. I stayed awake the rest of the night. The next morning, I headed west again. After another couple of hours, I found the road. My car was still there. No signs of tampering. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until I reached cell signal. I never went back to that canyon. I reported the tent and the gear to the ranger station, left a pin drop and photos, but they said they couldn't confirm anything without a full investigation. I don't know what happened to the person who left that tent. I don't know who the man I saw was, or if he was even real. Maybe he was a squatter. Maybe he thought I was trespassing. Maybe he wasn't trying to hurt me at all. But I know what I felt out there. It was wrong. Something wasn't right in that place. and I've never hiked alone again. I went on that hike in the summer of 2019 in the northern part of Idaho, near a small town called Libsyn. I had just turned 31 a few months earlier, and I'd been working remotely for over a year, which gave me the freedom to plan trips into nature more often. I lived alone in Spokane, and with no kids or partner to answer to, I had time to kill. I had gotten pretty into hiking over the last couple years. I'd done Mount Rainier the summer before, and I'd been slowly checking off more challenging trails. That week, I was looking for something quiet, something less traveled. I'd read about Dry Pine Trail in a forum post. It wasn't listed on any big hiking websites, but a guy in the comments section mentioned it as an unspoiled route with great mountain views and no crowds. That sounded perfect to me. I Googled what I could, found a couple of vague maps, and planned a 3-day solo hike. I wanted to do a loop through the Dry Pine area, sleeping out in the woods for 2 nights, and come back out near where I parked. I packed enough food for 3 days, brought my tent, water purifier, GPS device, emergency kit, and bear spray. I even packed extra socks and underwear, something I always regretted not doing on earlier trips. I drove out early on a Thursday morning and reached the rough dirt parking area around noon. There was only one other truck there, covered in dust. Looked like it had been there a few days. I didn't think much of it. The first stretch of trail was surprisingly easy. It passed through dry forest with tall pines and open ground below. There were no other people, no bugs, no sounds except the occasional rustling of branches. The air was dry and warm. I kept a decent pace, stopping once every couple of hours to drink water and rest. By 5 in the evening, I'd gone maybe 10 miles in. I found a flat spot between 2 boulders and set up my tent for the night. I ate some peanut butter and crackers and watched the sunset through the trees. It was one of those orange, cloudless skies that made you feel like the world was asleep. I felt peaceful. Not a single bad thought crossed my mind. That night, something woke me up. It was past midnight. I remember because I checked my watch. I'd heard a branch snap. Not just a crack, but the kind of heavy snap that comes from something big stepping on it. I laid there in the dark, holding my breath, my ears strained for more sounds. I thought maybe it was a deer, maybe an elk. I'd seen signs on the drive and warning about moose, but I hadn't seen anything in person. I stayed still for a long time. I didn't hear anything else. No sniffing, no crunching, no footfalls. Eventually, I fell back asleep. When I woke up around 7, I packed up quickly. The air was colder than I expected. I made a mental note to keep my jacket more accessible. I moved on, keeping my pace steady. That day, the trail got thinner and more overgrown. The dry pine trees started thinning out, and I found myself walking along narrow ridgelines with steep drop-offs on either side. The map I had printed from a blog post wasn't very clear, and I started to notice that the trail didn't match the markers anymore. Around noon, I came to a split. There were no signs. One path went left, slightly downhill into a wooded area. The other went right, climbing higher toward exposed rock and what looked like an old fire watchpoint. My printed map showed a loop that bent north around a ridgeline, and I figured that must be the left fork. I was wrong. I took the left and headed down into the woods. The trees grew denser again. It got darker and quieter. The trail became harder to see. I walked for over an hour before realizing something felt wrong. The path had faded to almost nothing. I started seeing small game trails, not a maintained footpath. I stopped and pulled out my GPS device. It showed my location deep in the national forest but couldn't find a trail nearby. I tried comparing it with my map, but the landmarks didn't match. No rivers, no clear peaks, just trees. I turned back, or I thought I did. That's when things started getting strange in a very real, very uncomfortable way. I followed what I thought was the same path back uphill. I walked hard, expecting to hit that fork again, but it didn't come. Instead, the trail kept climbing, twisting, narrowing. At one point, I passed a rusted metal can on the side of the trail. It looked old, like from decades ago. I didn't remember seeing it before. That's when I realized I wasn't on the same trail anymore. I stopped, dropped my pack, and sat down. I tried not to panic. I forced myself to eat something and drink water. I turned on my GPS again and tried to text my location to a friend back home. No signal. I waited 10 minutes, tried again. Still nothing. My GPS worked fine for coordinates, but I had no way to send them out. I took a deep breath and decided to keep going uphill. I figured if I reached higher ground, I might get a signal or spot something familiar. I hiked for hours that afternoon, gaining elevation through thick undergrowth and trees. I passed fallen logs, old stumps, and once what looked like an abandoned hunter's blind. The air grew cooler and more still. I started feeling watched. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation, but the hairs on my neck wouldn't go down. Around 5 in the evening, I found a small clearing near some granite outcroppings and set up camp. I was exhausted. My legs hurt, my back ached, and my stomach was in knots. I didn't have the appetite to eat much, but I forced myself to chew on some trail mix and drink water. I barely had the energy to unzip my sleeping bag. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside made my heart jump. I heard small scratches, twigs breaking, the rustle of leaves. I kept my bear spray close. By morning, I'd made a decision. I had no idea where I was, but I needed to move downhill. All rivers and roads eventually run low, and people build roads near rivers. If I could find water, I could follow it to safety. I packed up again, this time more urgently, and started heading east and downhill using my compass. The next 2 days blurred together. I stopped counting hours. I followed dry creek beds and slid down muddy slopes. I climbed over fallen trees and fought through brambles that shredded my legs. My water filter broke when I slipped crossing a stream, and I had to boil water using my stove, which burned through fuel fast. My food was running low. I rationed it down to a few bites every couple of hours. I lost track of time. My watch said it was Sunday morning, which meant I'd been out 4 days. That's when I found the boot. It was lying in the mud near a collapsed tree. It was an old, brown hiking boot, partly covered in moss. A few feet away, I saw a broken strap from what looked like a backpack. I searched the area and found a torn piece of blue nylon caught in some branches. I didn't see any bones or clothes, just those few pieces. I got this awful feeling in my chest, like something had squeezed all the air out of me. I kept moving faster now. I didn't stop to rest. I kept imagining the person who left that boot. Maybe they'd gotten lost too. Maybe they'd never made it out. By late afternoon, I stumbled into something I hadn't seen in days. Tire tracks. Faint, old, but definitely man-made. I followed them. They led to a small, overgrown trail, barely wide enough for an ATV. My legs were shaking, but I pushed on. I walked for another hour before I saw it. A gate. Old, rusted, chained shut, but bent open just wide enough for a person to slip through. Beyond it was a dirt road. It wasn't marked, but it was real. I nearly cried. I walked that road for another few miles before I heard a truck in the distance. I waved both arms until the guy stopped. He looked shocked when he saw me. My face was scratched, my clothes were filthy, and I'd lost about 10 pounds. I didn't even try to explain. I just got in the truck. He drove me back to Libsyn, where I got checked at a clinic. Dehydrated, underfed, bruised, but alive. Looking back, I learned a few things from that hike. First, never trust a random blog map. Second, solo hiking in an unmarked area is dangerous, no matter how experienced you think you are. But most of all, I realized how quickly a small mistake can turn into something life-threatening. That one wrong turn took me off course for 4 days, nearly cost me my life. I never found out who the boot belonged to. I told the rangers and they said they'd check the area, but I never got a follow-up. Maybe it was old. Maybe it had been there for years. Or maybe someone else had made the same mistake I had, but wasn't as lucky. Since then, I've kept hiking, but I stick to marked trails now. I carry a satellite communicator with an SOS button. I always tell someone exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back, because I know now how fast things can go bad, and how the forest doesn't care if you're scared, tired, or lost. It just keeps going. My name is David Lane. I'm 36 years old, and I work in logistics for a warehouse company in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm in decent shape, not an athlete or anything, but I try to stay active, jog a few miles each week, lift a little in the mornings. I'm not married, no kids. I like to go hiking alone on weekends when I can get away. It gives me some time to think and clear my head from the noise of the work week. Back in early October 2022, I planned a solo hiking trip out in Colorado. I wanted to try something new and challenging, nothing too extreme, but off the beaten path enough that I'd be away from crowds. I had a week off and figured I could make a 4-day trip out of it. I found a lesser-known trail system in the San Juan Mountains, not too far from Lake City. It looked beautiful, high alpine meadows, dense pine forests, and just the right amount of climbing. It wasn't a national park, so it didn't get as much attention. That was part of the appeal. I researched the trail online, read trip reports, printed out maps, and downloaded GPS data to my phone. I also brought a physical topographic map and compass just in case. I had all the right gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, bear canister, medical kit, emergency beacon, and enough food for 5 days. I wasn't careless. I'd done trips like this before, just not this far from civilization. I drove out from Nebraska and parked my car at a small trailhead off a Forest Service road. There was only one other vehicle in the lot, a dusty white pickup with Texas plates. I locked up my car, strapped on my pack, and started the hike around 10 a.m. The trail began with a steady climb through thick conifers. It was quiet. I didn't see another soul all day. The air was cool and crisp, and there was frost on the edges of the plants near shaded parts of the trail. I made about 10 miles the first day and set up camp near a small creek. The silence was something else. No cars, no voices, just wind through the trees and the occasional bird. The second day went smoothly too. I climbed higher into the mountains and broke through the tree line. The views opened up into vast grassy basins surrounded by jagged peaks. I followed the GPS markers I'd loaded and made good time, covering another 12 miles. I saw elk in the distance, and a lone fox crossed the trail ahead of me at one point. That night, I camped near a glacial lake tucked in a bowl beneath a ridge. The stars were insane. I didn't even bother with the rainfly on my tent. I laid there and stared at the Milky Way until I fell asleep. Everything changed on the third day. I woke up around 6:30 a.m., made coffee and oatmeal, and packed up camp. The plan was to hike a loop that would eventually circle me back to my car by the afternoon of the fourth day. I had about 15 miles to cover that day, but it was mostly downhill. I figured I'd reach a lower valley by late afternoon and camp near a river crossing. I started hiking along a faint trail that cut across a sloping alpine meadow. The trail wasn't well maintained. Grass had overgrown parts of it, and I kept checking my GPS and map to make sure I was still on course. About 3 hours in, the terrain got rough. A rock slide had wiped out part of the trail, and I had to detour down into a gully. It took longer than I expected to climb out. I slipped twice, scraped my palms, and bent one of my trekking poles. I kept going, a little frustrated but not too worried. It was afternoon when I started descending into the next valley. The trees thickened again, and the trail became muddy and narrow. My phone still had GPS, but I noticed the trail on the screen wasn't matching what I was seeing. It seemed like the route had been rerouted or maybe updated since I downloaded the map. I figured I'd just stick to the terrain that made sense and rejoin the trail further down. Then I made a mistake. There was a fork where the trail split into two. One path looked more worn, the other was faint but seemed to head in the right direction. I checked the map and thought the faint one lined up better, so I took it. Within an hour, the trail vanished entirely. I was standing in a dense stretch of pine trees, dead branches crunching underfoot, with no clear trail in sight. I pulled out my phone and saw that I'd veered off the marked route entirely. I must have missed a turn or read the map wrong. No big deal, I thought. I'll just cut back west and reconnect. But that turned out to be harder than I expected. I walked for another hour, using the compass and the sun to guide me. But the terrain was uneven, full of thick underbrush, fallen logs, and steep inclines. I kept thinking the trail would appear just over the next ridge, but it didn't. Then I realized I was burning through more energy and water than I'd planned. I stopped to rest and looked at the map again. I was somewhere between two ridgelines but couldn't pinpoint exactly where. The GPS signal was spotty now. The clouds had rolled in. I started to feel the first flickers of real worry. I wasn't in danger yet, but I was definitely not where I was supposed to be. I had enough supplies for another 2 days, but if I didn't find the trail soon, I'd be pushing it. I decided to keep moving downhill, figuring that I'd hit a river or Forest Service road eventually. By late afternoon, my legs were aching. I'd been hiking through uneven ground all day, ducking under branches, climbing over logs, and stepping around rocks and wet patches. I slipped once and jammed my left wrist catching myself. Nothing serious, but it hurt. That night, I made camp in a flat spot near a dry creek bed. I boiled water for dinner and sat there, looking around at the trees. It was so quiet it made my ears ring. I realized I hadn't seen any sign of people all day. No trail markers, no campsites, no footprints. It hit me that if I twisted my ankle or something worse, I might not be found for a long time. I turned on my emergency beacon, just in case, but I didn't press the SOS. I didn't want to overreact. I figured I'd try again in the morning and give myself one more full day to get back on track. I slept badly. I kept waking up at small noises, branches snapping, wind blowing, something rustling. I told myself it was probably just deer, maybe elk. Nothing dangerous. But when you're alone in the woods and completely off trail, your brain runs wild. The next morning, I got moving early. My legs were sore, and my left wrist was swollen, but I packed up and headed west again. I climbed a ridge that looked like it might give me a view of the valley. When I reached the top, I saw more forest stretching out in every direction. No trails, no roads, no signs of human life. That's when I started to panic for real. I took inventory of my supplies. I had one more full meal, half a day's worth of trail mix, and about 1.5 liters of water. I could filter more water if I found a creek, but I'd need food. I decided to start marking my path with small rock cairns and snapped branches so I wouldn't walk in circles. I figured if I kept going west, I'd eventually hit something, a trail, a road, a cabin, anything. By noon, I found a small stream and refilled my bottles. The cold water helped me cool off and clear my head. I ate half my remaining food and kept going. I hiked for hours. No roads, no trails, nothing. Around 4 p.m., I saw a structure in the distance through the trees, a small shack or cabin. I hurried toward it, heart racing. When I got closer, I saw it was an old trapper's shelter, probably decades old. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were covered in moss. No one had been there in years. Inside, there was nothing but an old rusted stove, a broken cot, and some empty cans. I rested there for a while, trying to figure out my next move. I didn't want to sleep there. The place felt wrong. Not haunted or anything, just isolated and forgotten. I pressed on for another hour before setting up camp in a clearing. That night, the fear really started to sink in. I had one meal left. My phone battery was nearly dead. I could send an SOS, but I wasn't ready to admit failure yet. On the morning of the 5th day, I decided to hike straight west for as long as I could. I rationed my last bit of food and kept walking. Around noon, I finally saw something, power lines in the distance, cutting through the trees. I nearly cried. I followed them for hours, not caring where they led, just knowing they meant civilization. At sunset, I reached a dirt road. I walked along it for almost 2 more hours before I saw a house in the distance, a ranch-style place with a truck parked out front. I hiked up the driveway, waved my arms, and the homeowner saw me. He gave me water and let me sit on his porch while I explained what had happened. He let me use his landline to call for help. I didn't go to the hospital, but I rested there overnight and got a ride into town the next day. Turned out I'd gone nearly 18 miles off course. I'd veered into a part of the forest with no marked trails, and my phone's GPS data had been outdated. I was lucky to find that dirt road. If I'd gone the other way, I might still be out there. After that trip, I took a break from solo hiking. I still hike, but I stay on known trails now, and I always tell someone exactly where I'm going. That trip taught me how I was 34 years old when I decided to hike the Switchback Trail in Colorado alone. It was late September 2019. I'd taken a few weeks off work because I needed time to clear my head. Things at the office had been suffocating, and my personal life wasn't doing much better. I'd broken up with someone I thought I was going to marry, and that ended with a lot of silence, some crying, and a lease I had to get out of. The trail was my way of getting away from all of it for a while. Just me, some gear, and miles of silence. I chose the Switchback Trail because it wasn't very well known. It split off from the more popular Hollow Ridge Trail about 6 miles in and ran through about 30 miles of tough, hilly terrain with no campsites, no phone service, and almost no other hikers. I didn't want people around me. I wanted to be alone in a way that was rare these days. Total silence. Just trees, dirt, wind, and space to think. I packed light but smart 3 days worth of food, my best ultralight tent, sleeping bag, water filter, headlamp, 2 backup batteries, fire starter, compass, detailed paper maps, and a small emergency beacon. I left my car in a small dirt lot by the Hollow Ridge trailhead early on a Friday morning, before the sun was fully up. The lot was empty except for a pickup truck with a camper shell. I stretched, tightened my boots, and hit the trail with my trekking poles tapping rhythmically against the packed earth. The first part of the trail was easy, familiar. I'd done Hollow Ridge a few times before. Pine needles covered the ground like a soft carpet, and the air had that cold snap to it that told me fall was in full swing. Birds chirped high in the branches. The sun rose through the trees in streaks of gold. For the first hour, I moved fast, trying to put distance between myself and everything I'd left behind. When I hit the fork for the Switchback Trail, I paused. The wooden sign was weathered, half covered in moss. It pointed left, where the trail narrowed and curved sharply into a dense section of forest. I hadn't seen anyone so far, and I figured it'd stay that way. I turned onto the trail and kept walking. The incline started gradually. The trees closed in around me. The sounds changed. Less birdsong, more wind whispering through leaves, branches creaking. The ground was uneven, roots snaked across the path like veins. I had to focus on where I stepped. By mid-morning, I'd already climbed several hundred feet. The trail curved sharply every few hundred yards, hence the name. Each switchback was like a punch to the legs. I sweated through my shirt, even though the air was cool. The silence became heavier the higher I went. I stopped to filter water from a small stream around noon and ate a protein bar while sitting on a boulder. That first night, I set up camp off-trail on a flat patch of dirt between 2 dead trees. I cooked a small freeze-dried meal, stretched my legs, and watched the sky turn orange, then purple, then black. The stars were incredible out there. No light pollution, no city glow, just an endless ceiling of tiny white dots blinking above me. I slept lightly. The cold woke me up a few times. So did the occasional snap of a branch or rustle in the underbrush. Normal forest sounds. Still, my heart always kicked a little harder when I heard something nearby. That instinctive tension that comes with being out there alone. But nothing approached my tent. Nothing called out. Eventually, I drifted back into shallow sleep. The second day was tougher. The trail got steeper and the footing looser. I had to slow down. Around noon, I passed a faded boot print in the dirt. Fresh, but not very. Probably from a day or two before. I figured someone else had been through the trail recently, though I hadn't seen any sign of campfires or gear. Just that one boot print. Something about it stuck with me, but I shook it off. In the afternoon, clouds rolled in fast. No thunder, but the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. By late afternoon, I was walking with my jacket zipped to my chin, hood up. I started looking for a place to set up camp early. The last thing I wanted was to be pitching a tent in the dark while freezing rain came down. I found a decent spot tucked behind a fallen tree, slightly elevated and dry. I got the tent up fast, climbed inside, and ate cold food since I didn't want to risk building a fire with the wind howling the way it was. I journaled for a bit. Nothing deep, just a note about how my legs felt and how I was making decent time. Then, Just after I turned off my headlamp, I heard a noise. It wasn't much, just a soft crunch outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. My first thought was deer, maybe even a fox, but I froze listening. It didn't move fast like an animal. It moved slow, one footstep, then another, then nothing. I sat up, holding my breath. The tent walls shifted a little with the wind. I listened harder. No breathing, no movement, just the wind and the occasional creak from the trees. After a few minutes, I told myself it had to be a falling branch or a rock dislodged by wind. I lay back down, still tense, but eventually my body gave in to exhaustion. The next morning was cold and foggy. My fingers were stiff while I packed up. I looked around the campsite, trying to see if there were tracks or signs of anything walking through. I didn't see anything, but the ground was hard and dry. Nothing would have left much of a mark. The trail after that got rougher. The incline turned brutal. I was scrambling in places, using both hands. My calves burned, and I had to stop more often. I didn't see any animals. No birds, no squirrels. Just trees and rock and dead leaves. It was strange. Too quiet. That's when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. It was a strip of torn fabric, dangling from a branch just off the trail. Dark green, about 2 inches wide. Looked like it came from a jacket. It had dirt on it and what looked like a small tear, like it got caught on something sharp. I stared at it for a while. It looked fresh. The color hadn't faded. I kept walking, slower now, more alert. I started scanning the trail around me more carefully, looking for anything out of place. About 20 minutes later, I found a broken trekking pole half buried under leaves. Just one, snapped clean in half. The handle was still attached, and the rubber looked worn. My stomach twisted a little. That night, I didn't sleep well at all. I camped farther off trail than usual, down a small slope behind a rock outcropping. I didn't cook. I didn't even take my boots off. I just curled into my bag and listened. At one point, just after midnight, I heard the noise again. Slow footsteps, crunch, crunch, then silence. The worst part was the way it always stopped just outside my tent. Like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be seen, just wanted to let me know it was there. I lay frozen for what felt like hours, heart pounding. I gripped my knife inside my sleeping bag, sweating despite the cold. But again, nothing touched the tent. Nothing spoke or breathed. Just that eerie, deliberate stepping sound and then absolute stillness. In the morning, I packed up and moved fast. I was supposed to finish the loop that evening and camp near the trailhead before hiking back to the car in the morning. I figured if I pushed myself, I could reach the edge of the loop by mid-afternoon, maybe even get cell service. But the trail didn't cooperate. It narrowed, became overgrown, and in some spots, the switchbacks were almost vertical. I had to climb over logs, sidestep loose rock, and at one point I nearly slipped down a ravine when the trail eroded beneath me. That's when I saw the tarp. It was blue, crumpled under a tree about 30 feet off the trail. I stopped dead. I didn't want to go closer, but I couldn't ignore it. I climbed down carefully and approached. There was no one there, just a badly collapsed tent, a blue tarp partially covering it, and a rusted metal cup lying in the dirt. Clothes were scattered nearby, a boot missing its laces, pair of torn gloves. Everything was damp and looked abandoned. But what got me most was the backpack. It was leaning against a rock, unzipped, contents half spilled. I didn't touch anything, but I crouched down to look. Food wrappers, a headlamp, a small knife, and a notebook. I flipped it open. Just names, dates, and short journal entries. The last one was from August 19th, over a month ago. _ something's following me. I haven't seen it, but I keep hearing it at night. Always outside the tent. I'm leaving first thing in the morning. Don't care if I finish the hike. I just want to get out. _ My blood turned to ice. I stood up, heart racing. I backed away slowly, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. No sound. But that didn't mean I was alone. I turned and started back to the trail, moving as fast as I could without running. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop even when I stumbled and scraped my hand on a rock. I didn't stop when the trail curved and twisted so sharply I got dizzy. I just wanted out. By late afternoon, I saw the ridge, the end of the loop. I was almost out. My phone still had. It was September 2014. I had just turned 33, and I'd taken a few days off from work to clear my head. I lived in Asheville, North Carolina at the time, and hiking had always been my go-to for stress. The quiet, the rhythm of walking, the steady breathing. It all helped me think. That weekend, I decided to take a solo trip out to a remote part of the Great Smoky Mountains, not far from Fontana Lake. I'd done a few-day hikes around there before, but I wanted to try something longer and more challenging, something that would get me far enough out where I wouldn't see another person for miles. I planned a 2-night solo hike, about 30 miles round trip. It was an out-and-back route with one loop around the second day to explore some of the deeper parts of the forest. The terrain wasn't too technical, mostly old Forest Service trails that had gone a bit wild over the years. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, map, compass, bear spray, first aid kit, and plenty of food. I carried a Garmin inReach in case of emergencies, but I didn't plan to use it unless something went seriously wrong. I started hiking just before noon on a Friday. The weather was crisp, high 60s in the day, probably low 40s at night. The sky was clear, and the sun filtered through the trees just enough to make everything glow. Felt perfect. The first few miles went smoothly. The trail was quiet and overgrown in places, but it was easy enough to follow. The farther I got, the more the trees closed in, and the sounds of the road and the world faded into just the crunch of my boots and the wind through the leaves. By late afternoon, I had made it about 11 miles in, near a ridge where I planned to set up camp. I found a small clearing just off the trail with flat ground and a few down logs to sit on. I pitched my tent, filtered some water from a nearby creek, cooked some instant rice and beans, and sat quietly as the light faded. That night was cold and still. I heard the usual forest sounds: an owl somewhere off in the distance, small critters rustling around in the underbrush, but nothing out of the ordinary. I slept on and off, mostly from the cold and the hardness of the ground, but I felt safe. The next morning, I packed up early and followed the loop trail deeper into the backcountry. This section of the trail was less maintained, narrower, less traveled, and covered in wet leaves and loose rocks. I didn't mind. That's part of why I was out there, to get away. I walked for several hours, taking my time, checking the map occasionally. There were no trail markers except some faded blazes on trees and the occasional cairn someone had left behind. Around early afternoon, I stopped at a narrow valley between two ridges. The trail dipped down sharply into a dense hollow filled with fallen logs, moss-covered rocks, and a small stream cutting through the middle. It was beautiful in a quiet, untouched way. I took a few pictures, ate a granola bar, and kept moving. About 3 miles into the loop, I noticed a faint trail splitting off to the left. It wasn't marked on my map, but that wasn't unusual. The Smokies are full of old hunting trails and logging roads that never made it into the official records. I almost kept walking, but something about it caught my eye. It wasn't wide, but it looked like it had been used recently. There were boot prints in the mud, faint, but fresher than anything else I'd seen out there. I thought maybe it was a shortcut or a lesser-known route. I figured I'd follow it for a little while and see where it led. Worst case, I'd turn around, so I took the left fork. Almost immediately, the forest changed. The trees were closer together, and the trail got tighter, like it hadn't been used much. There were animal tracks, deer mostly, but also something else I couldn't place right away. The air felt heavier, not in a supernatural way, just different, like the trees were holding on to more moisture, or maybe the wind didn't make it down into that part as easily. I kept going. After about 45 minutes, I started getting uneasy. Not scared exactly, but alert. I hadn't seen any more boot prints, and the trail was thinning. It was more of a game trail than anything now. Branches scratched my arms as I pushed through. I checked my compass and saw that I was heading south-southwest, which was generally okay. Still within the range of my planned loop, but something didn't feel right. I thought about turning back, but I kept pushing forward. I don't know why. Maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity. I followed the trail for another 20 minutes until it dropped steeply down into a gully. That's when I smelled something. It was faint at first, just a hint of something sour or metallic on the air. I stopped walking and breathed in through my nose. It wasn't a natural smell. It reminded me of old blood and wet dirt. I walked a bit farther and saw a dark shape ahead, half hidden in the undergrowth. It was a deer carcass. It had been dead for maybe a day or two, hard to tell. Its ribcage was torn open and mostly picked clean, but not by scavengers. This wasn't the work of coyotes. The wounds were too clean, too precise. The legs were twisted in odd angles, like they'd been broken deliberately. There were drag marks leading away from the body, like someone had moved it, then left it there. I froze. My first thought was that it might have been a hunter, but hunting was illegal in that part of the park. And this wasn't dressed or butchered, it was destroyed, left to rot. Something about it felt deliberate. I started backing up, slowly, keeping my eyes on the treeline. I didn't hear anything. No movement, no voices, no animals. Just the sound of my boots in the leaves and the blood pumping in my ears. I turned and walked fast, retracing my steps up the trail. I kept checking over my shoulder. Still nothing, but the feeling in my gut didn't go away. I was being watched. Back near where the fork had split off, I noticed something I hadn't before. A tree with deep gouges in the bark about shoulder height. Fresh cuts, 5 of them spaced like fingers. Not from a bear or a cat, too deliberate. These were made by a knife. That was enough for me. I broke into a jog and didn't stop until I reached the main loop again. I hiked fast for the next few miles, barely stopping to drink water. I had planned to spend one more night in the woods, but I changed my plan. I wanted out. I made it back to the ridge around dusk and decided to camp in the same spot I had the night before. I didn't want to hike in the dark, and I didn't want to risk getting turned around on the way out. I set up my tent quickly, ate a cold energy bar for dinner, and kept my bear spray within reach. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the deer, the gouges in the tree, and the feeling that someone or something had been watching me. Every time a twig snapped outside my tent, I jolted awake. I held my breath and listened. Nothing ever came close, but I never felt alone. The next morning, I packed up at first light and started hiking out. I moved fast and didn't stop for anything. I reached my car by mid-afternoon. It was still there, untouched. The parking lot was empty except for one other vehicle, a beat-up green pickup with out-of-state plates and no park pass. I didn't wait around to see who it belonged to. I drove straight back to Asheville. When I got home, I unpacked, showered, and tried to shake the tension out of my shoulders. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw, not right away. I wasn't even sure what I'd really seen. Maybe it was just a weird hunting accident. Maybe someone was poaching and didn't want to be found. Maybe I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But a week later, I looked up news from that area. Buried in a local forum post was a mention of missing hikers in the park over the past few years. Most were chalked up to accidents, falls, getting lost. But there were rumors. One person mentioned finding strange animal remains. Another talked about hearing whistling deep in the woods at night. No answers, just unease. I haven't gone back to that part of the Smokies since. I still hike, but I stick to places where I'm not the only one on the trail. I still carry the Garmin, and I trust my gut more than ever. What I saw wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a monster or a ghost. It was something real, something human. And that's what makes it worse. There are people out there who go deep into the woods and don't want to be found. Some of them are running from something. Some of them are looking for something. And some of them are waiting. I was lucky. I got out. But I'll never forget the feeling of walking down that unmarked trail, knowing I wasn't supposed to be there, knowing someone else had been there just before me, and that they might still be out there watching, waiting for someone else to come a little too far off the map. In the summer of 2019, I took a solo hiking trip in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. I was 34 at the time, working a desk job in Boise. I didn't have a wife or kids. My life was quiet and predictable, and I think I liked it that way. But every now and then, I needed to get out, away from glowing screens, traffic, emails, and the dead rhythm of city life. So once or twice a year, I'd take time off and go hiking alone for a few days. This particular trip was supposed to be a 4-day loop through some lesser-used trails near Stillwater Ridge. I'd found the route online, pieced together from parts of older trails that weren't maintained much anymore. The appeal was that it looped through wild country, less chance of running into anyone, more chance of actually feeling like I was out there. It was about 30 miles total, with a lot of elevation change and some river crossings. Challenging but doable. I've been hiking since my 20s. I wasn't some elite survivalist or anything, but I knew what I was doing. I'd been through bad weather, gotten turned around a few times, had some close calls with injuries, but nothing crazy. I was always cautious, and I never pushed myself past what I knew I could handle. This loop seemed like a good next challenge. I started at a small gravel trailhead just past a place called Larch Creek, where the forest road dead-ended. There were no other cars there. That was the first thing that made me feel like I was really going off the map. The second was the trail itself, more of an overgrown path than a maintained route. But I had a printed map, compass, and GPS. I'd marked water sources and potential campsites. I felt ready. The first day went smoothly. I hiked about 9 miles up into the ridgeline. The climb was steep in places, and the trail was hard to follow, but I made good time. The forest was thick with old pines, quiet except for the birds and the wind. Every so often, I'd hear something bigger move through the underbrush, maybe a deer or elk, but nothing too close. I set up camp near a stream in a clearing around 6 p.m., filtered water, ate dinner, and settled into my tent as the light faded. I remember lying there feeling completely content, tired but relaxed. It was the next morning when things started to shift. I woke early around sunrise. The air was cold, the kind that sits in your chest. I packed up and got moving, heading along a narrow trail that curved up around the shoulder of Stillwater Ridge. This section was supposed to give me some great views of the valley below. But a few miles in, I lost the trail. Completely. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it just got harder to see, covered with fallen branches and pine needles. Then the trees thinned out, and suddenly there was nothing. Just sloped ground, rock outcroppings, and scattered brush. I doubled back, thinking I'd just missed a marker, but it was no good. Everything looked the same. I took out my GPS, but it wasn't giving me a solid location. Maybe the trees had interfered with the signal earlier. My compass pointed me in the general direction I needed to go, but that didn't help me find the trail. Still, I didn't panic. I'd lost trails before. I knew how to bushwhack and reconnect later. I figured if I stayed north-northeast along the ridge, I'd eventually intersect with the trail again. It was supposed to loop that way, forming a kind of arc before heading down to the valley. I kept moving, careful with my footing, checking my compass every 10 minutes. That went on for hours. Around midday, I stopped to eat and realized I hadn't seen any sign of the trail, not even a boot print or broken branch. Worse, the terrain was getting rougher. More boulders, steeper slopes, and thick brush that slowed me down. There were signs of wildlife too, more than before. I saw fresh scat, tracks, even a spot where something large had bedded down recently. Could have been deer, but I started to get that feeling like I wasn't alone. That afternoon, the weather started to shift. Clouds moved in fast. I couldn't see the sun anymore, and the wind picked up. I was higher up on the ridge now, and the trees were more spaced out, so there was less shelter. I didn't like the idea of being stuck up there in a storm. I needed to find a place to camp and wait it out. I found a flat spot tucked between two large rocks, about 20 feet across. It wasn't ideal, but it would block the wind. I set up my tent quickly, anchored it with rocks, and cooked dinner crouched behind one of the boulders. The wind kept gusting, and it started to rain just as I finished eating. I got in my tent, zipped everything tight, and lay there listening to the storm. It rained hard most of the night. I didn't sleep much. The wind would hit in bursts, shaking the tent, and I kept imagining trees snapping or rocks tumbling. Around 3 a.m., I heard something big moving nearby, just a few slow steps through the wet brush, maybe 20 yards off. I lay completely still, heart pounding. It didn't come closer, and eventually it moved away. Could have been a moose or a bear. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, everything was soaked. The rain had stopped, but fog covered the ridge, thick enough that I couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. My map was waterlogged, even though I'd kept it in a plastic sleeve. My GPS was working again, but the battery was low. I checked the compass and tried to orient myself, but the fog made it impossible to tell if I was following the contour of the ridge or veering off it. I hiked slowly, feeling uneasy the whole time. There were more animal signs, tracks, scratches on trees, overturned rocks. The weird part was how fresh they looked. I wasn't even sure I was seeing different animals anymore. It felt like something was pacing me, keeping just out of sight. That night, I found a rocky ledge overlooking a slope. I camped there so I could see what was below me. The view was still fogged in, but at least I wasn't surrounded on all sides. I ate a cold meal and tried to rest, but I kept waking up. Once to a snapping branch, another time to what sounded like footsteps in the dark. Not fast or aggressive, just careful, like something circling. On the fourth day, I ran out of dry socks. My boots were soaked. I had blisters on both feet, and my legs were covered in scratches from bushwhacking. I was tired, cold, and starting to feel that creeping panic that comes when your confidence wears off. I knew I needed to head downhill and find water. That would lead me to the valley and back toward the trailhead. Simple logic. Rivers run down. Trails run near rivers. I started following a dry creek bed, hoping it would connect to something. It wasn't on my map, but it went northeast, and I knew the main trail should cross a larger stream in that direction. The terrain got worse the lower I went. Steep sides, loose rocks, fallen trees. At one point I slipped and landed hard on my hip, knocked the wind out of me. I lay there a long time, just staring at the sky through the trees. Eventually I got moving again, slower now, favoring my right leg. I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my steps, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. The way the hairs on your arms stand up when something's wrong. I kept turning around, but nothing was ever there. Around mid-afternoon, I found a tree stand, an old one, wooden slats nailed into a pine, leading to a rotting platform maybe 15 feet up. It looked abandoned, but not ancient. There was a rusted tin can up there, and the ladder rungs were still intact. Seeing something human out there after days alone gave me a strange sense of comfort. I climbed up just to get a better look at the area. From the top, I could see a line of thick trees leading to what looked like a clearing a half-mile downhill. I made for it, limping and stopping often. My legs were shot, and my stomach was cramping from not eating enough. I reached the clearing as the sun started to set. It was a wide, flat area maybe once used for logging. There were stumps, piles of branches, and in the center, the rusted frame of an old pickup. Completely gutted. No tires, no engine, just a shell. That's when I knew something was wrong. There were signs someone had been there recently. Boot prints, a tarp strung between two trees, burned logs from a campfire, but there was no one around. No gear, no food, just scraps. An empty lighter, a broken shovel, a torn jacket sleeve. Everything about it felt wrong, like someone left in a hurry, or worse, never left. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a rock, knife in my hand, bear spray on my belt. I kept hearing rustling in the trees, branches cracking, something moving just far enough that I couldn't see it. I kept scanning the woods, waiting. My flashlight caught eyes at one point, low to the ground, maybe 30 feet off. They vanished as soon as I turned toward them. I left at dawn. No breakfast, just packed and moved. My GPS was dead now. I was relying only on my compass and whatever terrain I could read. I followed the clearing downhill until I hit another dry creek. I kept thinking I'd hit water, civilization, a road, anything. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Olympic National Forest in Washington. It was the summer of 2017, mid-July. I had a week off work and needed to get away. Life in Portland had been hectic lately. Loud neighbors, late hours at the shop, and too much time stuck in traffic. I wanted silence, space, and air that smelled like pine needles and wet dirt. I picked a loop trail I found on a hiking forum. It wasn't very popular, which was exactly what I wanted, something off the beaten path. The loop was about 45 miles long and climbed into some pretty remote terrain. Most people did it in 4 or 5 days, but I planned to take 6 to go slow and enjoy it. I parked my car at a small gravel trailhead about 20 miles from the nearest town. There were only 2 other vehicles there, both dusty old pickups. I didn't see anyone around. The trail sign was faded and the wooden post leaned slightly, like it had been slowly sinking for years. I strapped on my pack, around 40 pounds including food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, and bear canister, and started walking. The first day was peaceful. I moved through deep forest, thick with cedar, spruce, and fir trees. Sunlight filtered through in patches, lighting up ferns and mossy logs. I heard birds, the occasional rustle of something moving away from the trail, and the wind high up in the canopy. I didn't see another person all day, and that was just fine with me. I set up camp near a small creek around 6 p.m., cooked a quick dinner of rice and jerky, and sat with my back against a tree until the stars came out. The second day took me higher into the hills. The trail narrowed and grew rockier, winding along ridges with steep drop-offs to one side. At one point, I stopped for a long time just to watch fog rise up through the valley below me. It was beautiful and completely quiet. That night, I camped on a flat stretch near a high meadow. My feet hurt and my legs were tired, but it felt good. I was starting to relax in a way I hadn't in months. It was on the third day things started to feel different. The trail forked unexpectedly in the early afternoon. According to my map and GPS, it wasn't supposed to. There was no signpost, just 2 paths. One continued upward in a gentle climb. The other dropped into thicker forest. The higher trail looked newer, like it had been maintained more recently. The lower trail was narrow, half overgrown in places, and disappeared into shadows. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what to do. My gut told me to take the lower trail. Maybe it was the original route and the upper one had been added later. I checked the GPS again, it flickered, then froze. Nothing I did would make it respond. I still had my paper map, but the spot I was at didn't show any fork. I figured it must be the old trail. I went left downhill. It was slower going. Fallen branches and roots snagged my boots, and the brush closed in on both sides. The trail felt older, like it hadn't seen traffic in years. After about an hour, I started to feel like I'd made a mistake. It was too late to turn back for the day, so I kept going. I told myself I'd find a place to camp soon and figure things out in the morning. Around dusk, I reached a small clearing with a fire ring made from old stones. It looked like someone had used it a long time ago. There was a rotting log nearby I used as a bench while I set up my tent. I was tired, more mentally than physically. Something about the forest down here felt different, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. I couldn't hear birds anymore. Even the wind sounded different, like it got muffled by the trees. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up thinking I heard something moving outside. A slow step, then silence. Then maybe another. It wasn't loud, if it was anything at all. Could have been branches falling or an animal passing through. Still, I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I felt groggy and uneasy. My GPS still wasn't working, and the trail looked even more overgrown ahead. But I didn't want to backtrack. I figured I'd keep moving and eventually reconnect with the main loop. There were several junctions according to the map, even if this one hadn't been on it. By late morning, the trail was barely a trail at all. I had to push branches aside and step over old logs covered in moss. I slipped a few times on the damp ground. Once, I caught my foot on a root and fell hard on my left side, jarring my ribs. Nothing broke, but it hurt like hell and knocked the wind out of me. I sat there for a while before getting up again. I was bleeding a little from my elbow, and dirt had gotten into the scrape. I kept going. It was early afternoon when I realized I was off trail entirely. I had been following what looked like a game path without realizing it. I stopped. I looked around. Nothing looked familiar. No trail markers, no sign of footprints or other hikers. I climbed a short slope to get a better view, but all I saw were trees in every direction. The canopy was too thick to make out landmarks. That was the first time I really felt afraid. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. I checked the map again. It was useless here. The GPS was still frozen. I sat down and forced myself to think clearly. I wasn't hurt badly, I had food and water, and I could backtrack until I found the trail again. I just had to stay calm and pay attention. I walked back the way I thought I had come. After half an hour, nothing looked familiar. I saw a patch of disturbed ground and thought maybe I had stepped there earlier, but I couldn't be sure. Everything started to look the same. The sun was sinking again. I hadn't made progress. I realized I'd been walking in a wide circle. That night, I didn't make a fire. I set up the tent in a hurry and got inside, heart pounding. I felt completely alone. Not in the peaceful way from the first night, but like the forest had closed in on me, like it didn't want me there anymore. I heard movement again, louder this time, leaves crunching, a slow step, then nothing. I held my breath. It happened again an hour later, another step, then silence. I sat up in the tent, clutching my knife. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed up and started walking again. I tried to head east using the sun as a guide. I rationed water and food now. I didn't want to admit I was lost, but I knew I was. Every hill I climbed looked like the last one. Every grove of trees could have been the one before it. Around noon, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a torn strip of red nylon tent fabric caught on a branch. Below it, part of a frame pole stuck out from a pile of leaves. I moved the leaves carefully, and under them was an old, collapsed tent. The nylon was sun-faded and torn in places. Inside, there were scraps of gear, a rusted cook pot, part of a boot, a moldy foam pad. No sign of a person. No bones, no clothes, no ID. But someone had been here a long time ago. The tent had been buried by years of debris. I stared at it for a long time. I almost turned and ran, but I forced myself to walk away slowly. That night, I didn't set up my own tent. I slept in my bag under a thick pine tree. I was shaking most of the night. I didn't hear anything this time, just the wind and branches creaking, but my mind kept going back to that tent. The fifth day, I got desperate. I started yelling now and then, hoping someone might hear. No one answered. I hadn't seen another soul in days. My legs were scratched up from pushing through brush. My ribs still hurt from the fall. I was down to 2 liters of water and 1 meal left. I had started to get dizzy when I walked too fast. My head ached. My lips were cracked and dry. I climbed another ridge and saw nothing but forest on all sides. But when I looked to the northwest, I thought I saw a straight line, something not natural. I adjusted my position. It was faint, but it looked like a dirt road. Not close, maybe a few miles away. Could have been anything, but it was the only thing I'd seen that wasn't trees. I decided to go toward it. Took the rest of the day. I had to bushwhack through thick brush, cross a narrow creek, and climb a steep hill covered in loose rock. I slipped and cut my hand. Blood ran down my fingers and soaked into my shirt. I wrapped it in a spare bandana and kept going. Just before sunset, I reached the edge of the forest and stepped onto a narrow gravel road. I almost cried when I saw it. It looked unused, maybe a service road, but it was flat and open. I turned right and walked along it until full dark, then made camp by the side of the road. The 6th morning, I was woken by the sound of an engine. It was a pickup truck coming slowly around a bend. I ran into the middle of the road and waved both arms. The driver stopped, looking surprised and concerned. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, and he asked me if I was all right. I nodded, then shook my head. I didn't even know what to say. He drove me into town, gave me water, and let me charge my phone. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I'd gotten lost, that my GPS broke, and I was off the trail for 3 days. He told me I was lucky, that the area I'd come out of was barely mapped and had seen some search and rescue missions. I was 32 the year it happened. It was the spring of 2018, early May, just as the frost had given up on the trees and the sun started staying out longer. I'd been hiking for years, on and off since college. I wasn't an expert, but I was confident, careful, and experienced enough to know what I was doing. That's probably why I let my guard down. The place was called Split Ridge, somewhere in western North Carolina. Not a famous trail, but one of those spots you find on old hiking forums where people talk like they know something special. One guy had posted a trip report saying it was beautiful, almost completely empty, and ran for miles through pine forests, ravines, and narrow ridgelines. It had no official website or maps from the Park Service, but someone uploaded a GPS trace of the route that looked manageable. I loaded it onto my Garmin and printed a backup copy from Google Earth just in case. I drove down from Asheville on a Thursday afternoon, parked my car at a gravel pull-off near the base of the trail, and planned to spend 2 nights out there. The idea was to loop out along the ridge, camp near a stream marked about 12 miles in, then cut back across an old fire road on the return. A big circle about 24 miles in all. That's not extreme. I'd done longer solo hikes. I brought a full pack, tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, first aid, and even a satellite beacon. I wasn't being reckless. It was cloudy when I started. Cool, but not cold. The trailhead wasn't marked with anything more than a faded pink ribbon tied around a tree, but I could see the path. It was narrow and a little overgrown, but clearly used by someone in the past year. First, I felt good. The land was quiet. No road sounds. No cell service. Just trees creaking in the wind and the crunch of my boots on the trail. That first day, I made good progress, climbing up through the wooded slopes until I reached the start of the ridge. Split Ridge lived up to the name. It was a thin stretch of high ground, maybe 4 feet across in places, dropping sharply on either side. It wasn't dangerous if you paid attention, but it made me move slower. The wind picked up out there. I tightened the straps on my pack and kept moving. The view from the top was beautiful. Endless trees in every direction, waves of green rolling toward the horizon. No buildings, no roads, no other people. Around 5 p.m., I dropped off the ridge into a valley and followed the trail along the bank of a shallow stream. The campsite I had marked was a little up from the water, flat and open. I set up my tent, boiled some rice and beans, and sat with my back against a tree as the sky dimmed. I didn't bring a fire starter, just a stove. I don't like the hassle of building fires, and I was trying to keep my impact small. The forest dimmed slowly. I heard frogs and the occasional splash from the stream. Nothing unusual. The first night was quiet. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to pee, stepped outside the tent, and looked around. The trees moved softly in the wind. The moon was out, filtered through a thin sheet of clouds. I didn't feel anything wrong. Not then. The next morning, I packed up early and got moving. My legs felt strong. The GPS trace showed another 8 miles to the fire road that would cut me back toward the start. I figured I'd get there by late afternoon, camp somewhere along the road, then hike the last 6 miles back to my car the following morning. That was the plan. About 3 hours into the second day, the trail started getting sketchier. The path narrowed again, winding along the side of a slope thick with thorny brush. I pushed through slowly, occasionally checking the GPS to make sure I was still on course. The blue dot lined up with the red trail, but the land didn't match what I expected. The GPS showed the trail bending left toward a stream crossing. Instead, the land curved right and rose steeply uphill. I thought maybe the satellite data was just off by a bit. It happens in the woods. So I climbed the hill, figuring I'd reconnect with the trail further up. After about 15 minutes of scrambling over roots and loose rock, I realized I'd lost it. I stood still, breathing hard, and tried to retrace my steps. That's when the GPS shut off. Just blinked out. Screen went dark. I tried turning it on again, thinking maybe the battery had died. I always carry spare AAs. Swapped them out, still nothing. I tapped it, pressed the power button, held it down. Nothing. Dead. It wasn't the end of the world. I had the printed map and compass. I sat down on a fallen log, drank some water, and pulled out the paper copy. It didn't have great detail, just a rough trace over satellite imagery, but it showed the ridgeline, the stream, and the fire road. I figured I could head west and downhill and eventually hit the fire road. I took a compass bearing and started moving. But within 20 minutes, I was in deep brush, waist-high grass, thorny vines, and loose rocks. I tripped more than once. The land wasn't what I expected. Steeper, rougher, more overgrown. That's when I first saw the debris. It was a rusted metal drum, half buried in dirt near the base of a small slope. Next to it was a shattered crate with old, cracked glass bottles inside. One still had a label on it, though faded and unreadable. It looked like it had been there for decades. Farther up the slope, I saw what looked like a collapsed shed. Just a pile of old planks and a rusted-out metal frame. I didn't think too much of it. Probably leftovers from an old moonshine operation or hunting shack. But I started noticing more odd things. Strands of old barbed wire strung through trees. A rusted saw blade. A tire rim wedged between roots. None of it recent. Nothing useful. But it was clear this wasn't just wilderness. Someone had been out here a long time ago, doing something. I kept walking west, trying to find the fire road. I expected to hit it within an hour or two. Instead, the ground dropped into a ravine, forcing me to detour north. The forest thickened. My boots slipped on wet leaves. My legs started cramping. By 4 p.m., I was exhausted. I hadn't seen the fire road. I hadn't seen any trail. I hadn't seen anything that looked like the terrain on the map. I decided to stop and set up camp early. There was no clear spot, so I made do with a patch of semi-level ground beneath a massive oak tree. It was quieter than the first night. No frogs, no birds, just wind and the occasional creak of trees shifting. I felt unease for the first time. Not fear exactly, just a tightness in my chest. A sense that something was wrong with the land. That night I had trouble sleeping. I heard something outside the tent. Not close, just movement in the woods. A soft rustling that didn't sound like wind or falling branches. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. I didn't unzip the tent. Just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. In the morning, I packed up fast. My legs ached. I slept poorly, ate a protein bar, drank filtered water, and started walking. I didn't know where I was anymore. The compass said east was back toward the trailhead, so I followed that direction, hoping to either hit the fire road or retrace my steps to the original path. Hours passed. The forest didn't change. Same tight trees, same thorny brush, same silence. Then I saw the marker. It was a pink ribbon tied to a tree branch, same as the one at the trailhead. But the tree it was on was dead. Gray bark, no leaves. The ribbon was faded, nearly white. For a moment, I thought I'd made it back to the trail. I looked around for footprints or signs of passage. Nothing, just one ribbon, then nothing else. I walked in circles for nearly an hour, hoping to find another marker, but there was nothing. No trail, no people, just trees. I moved downhill again, hoping to find water. I did another shallow stream. I followed it for an hour until it dropped off into a narrow gorge. I climbed down carefully, clinging to roots and rocks, and reached the bottom. That's when I found the cabin. It wasn't much, just a rotted wooden structure tucked into the rocks above the stream. The door was gone. The roof sagged. It looked abandoned for decades, but someone had built it way out here, away from everything. I stepped inside. A stank of mold and rot. The floor was soft with dirt. A rusted cot sat against the far wall, collapsed in the middle. There were old metal cans on a shelf, empty, rodent droppings in the corners. It wasn't shelter. It was a ruin. I left quickly. The place unsettled me. There was no reason for it to be out there. No road, no trail, just wilderness and a rotting shack in the middle of nowhere. I climbed back out of the gorge and kept moving. My legs shook with fatigue. My water was low. I kept filtering from streams, but the taste was off, metallic and bitter. By sunset, I hadn't found any sign of a trail or road. I camped again, This time on a slope so steep I had to brace myself against a tree to keep from sliding. That night I heard the sound again. Movement, but closer this time. Still not loud. Just the sound